Welcome, dear listener, to another journey into the past. Not the glorious romanticized past of Hollywood epics, but the tedious, often brutal reality that most people actually experienced. I hope this video finds you in a comfortable place, perhaps settling in for the night wherever you are in the world. If you're new here, welcome to Boring History for Sleep, where we explore the unglamorous details that textbooks skip over. And if you've been with us before, thank you for returning. If you enjoy this kind of content, please consider subscribing. It helps more than you might imagine and costs you nothing but a single click. Tonight, we're venturing into the Norse world of the Viking Age, but we won't be discussing raids or longships or warrior glory. Instead, we'll be examining the daily existence of a group of women whose lives have been thoroughly romanticized in popular culture, the frilla, or Viking concubines. You've likely seen them portrayed in films and television shows. Beautiful women in flowing dresses, living in wealthy households, perhaps enjoying some degree of comfort or even romance. The reality, as you might expect from this channel, was considerably different. These were unfree women, captives taken in raids or born into servitude, who performed back-breaking labour while being legally classified as property rather than persons. Over the next 2.5 hours or so, we'll walk through their actual daily routine, the legal structures that defined their existence, the physical toll their lives extracted, and the archaeological evidence that tells us what sagas and histories often omitted. This won't be easy listening. Their lives were hard and the details are often disturbing, but I think there's value in understanding the reality behind the romance. So settle in, close your eyes if you wish, and let's step back nearly 1,000 years to understand what a Viking concubine's life actually looked like, from the moment she woke in darkness to the moment she collapsed in exhaustion, day after grinding day. Picture, if you will, the Scandinavian world between roughly 793 and 1066 CE, the period historians designate as the Viking Age. This was a landscape of extraordinary harshness, particularly in Norway and the more northern reaches of Sweden. Winters stretched for months, with only 4 to 6 hours of weak sunlight, even at midday during December and January. The growing season was short, the soil often poor, and survival required constant, exhausting labour from every member of a household. The majority of the population lived on isolated farmsteads, scattered across fjords, valleys, and coastal plains. These weren't villages in any modern sense, but rather individual family compounds separated by considerable distances, connected by rough paths through forests and over mountains. A prosperous farm might include a longhouse as the primary structure, a windowless rectangular building perhaps 60 feet long and 15 feet wide, along with smaller outbuildings for animals, storage and workshops. The longhouse itself served all functions: sleeping quarters, kitchen, workshop, storage and social space, all under one roof with an open hearth running down the centre. This was also the era of Norse expansion, the period of raids, exploration and settlement that would take Scandinavian warriors and traders from Constantinople to Newfoundland. But those famous voyages rested on an economic foundation that's less often discussed: a massive slave economy. Raiding wasn't simply about treasure and glory, it was also about acquiring human property. Irish monasteries, Anglo-Saxon villages and Slavic settlements all provided a steady supply of captives who were either kept as household slaves or sold in thriving slave markets throughout the Norse world. By some estimates, thralls, unfree people, comprised between 10 and 30% of the Scandinavian population during this period. Every raid, every ship that returned, potentially brought more people into bondage. The climate itself shaped daily existence in profound ways. Long winters meant that households needed to preserve food, maintain fires constantly, and survive months of relative confinement in smoky, dark interiors. The brief summers demanded frantic agricultural work, ploughing, planting, tending, harvesting, all compressed into a few months before the frees returned. And in this world of constant labour, the work fell disproportionately on those with the least power, the unfree members of the household, and particularly the unfree women. Norse society was rigidly hierarchical, with social status determining virtually every aspect of existence. At the top were the jarls, aristocrats who owned substantial land and commanded the loyalty of many households. Below them were the carls, free farmers and craftsmen who owned property and had legal standing. And at the bottom were the thralls, who owned nothing, not even themselves. But within the category of unfree people, there were gradations and complications, and this is where the frilla enters our story. The term frilla doesn't translate neatly into English. Concubine is the closest approximation, but it carries connotations that don't quite fit. A frilla was an unfree woman who bore her master's children but was not his legal wife. She occupied a strange liminal space, more than a simple household slave in that she had a sexual and reproductive relationship with the household's male head, but far less than a wife in legal terms. To understand her position, we need to understand Norse marriage and inheritance law. A legal marriage required formal proceedings, witnesses, a bride price paid to the woman's family, and a mourning gift from husband to wife after the wedding night. A married woman retained certain property rights and legal personhood. Her children were legitimate heirs with full inheritance rights. She could testify in legal proceedings, could own property separately from her husband, and enjoyed certain protections under law. A frilla had none of these things. The relationship required no ceremony, no witnesses, no bride price. A man simply took a woman into his bed, and if she was unfree, she had no legal ability to refuse. Any children born of this union belonged entirely to the father. They were legitimate in the sense that he could acknowledge them as his own, but they had no claim on their mother's family line because, legally speaking, she had no family line. She was property, and property cannot pass on inheritance. This created households that could be extraordinarily complex from a modern perspective. A wealthy man might have a legal wife, a woman of his own social class, properly married with all the attendant ceremonies, and also one or more frilla, women who shared his bed and bore his children but had no legal standing. The wife was the husfreyja, the lady of the house, who managed the household and held authority over everyone in it, including the frilla. The frilla, meanwhile, occupied an impossible position. Intimately connected to the household's power structure through her sexual relationship with the master, yet subordinate to everyone, vulnerable to the jealousy and resentment of the legal wife, and with no recourse if abused or discarded. The sagas, those medieval Icelandic texts that preserve many stories from the Viking Age, mention frilla frequently, but almost always in passing. They're rarely central characters. Instead, they appear in phrases like, Thorstein had a frilla named Gudrun, or he sold his frilla and her children. They're narrative furniture, present but not particularly important to the storytellers who were, after all, writing for an audience of free landowners who would identify with the male household heads, not with unfree women. This means that while we know frilla existed, and we know roughly what their legal status was, the details of their daily lived experience are harder to reconstruct. This is where archaeology becomes crucial. Skeletal remains from excavated settlements can tell us about patterns of injury, nutritional deficiency and disease. Grave goods, or the lack thereof, indicate social status. The physical layout of longhouses and the distribution of artifacts within them show us who slept where, who ate what, who had access to combs and jewellery and who didn't. Chemical analysis of bones can reveal diet and geographic origin. Together, these sources let us reconstruct lives that the written record mostly ignored. In popular culture today, the Viking concubine has become a romantic figure. She appears in historical novels, in television shows, in fantasy fiction inspired by Norse culture. She's typically portrayed as beautiful, exotic, perhaps a captive Irish princess or a mysterious Slavic woman, living in a wealthy household where she enjoys some comfort despite her unfree status. Sometimes she's depicted as wielding power through her sexual relationship with a chieftain. Sometimes she's shown as a romantic figure, caught in a love triangle between master and wife. The HBO series Vikings featured several such characters. Romance novels set in this period are rife with them. But here's the uncomfortable truth that we'll be exploring over the next 2 hours. A Viking frilla's daily existence was defined by brutal physical labour, sexual availability without consent, legal non-personhood, and the constant threat of violence, separation from any children she bore, and disposal when she was no longer useful. Her life was short. Most didn't live to 40, and many died in their 20s or 30s from sheer physical exhaustion, complications from repeated pregnancies, or workplace accidents that went untreated. She woke before dawn and worked until collapse. She had no control over her own body, no right to refuse sexual access, no ability to protect her children, and no hope of improvement in her circumstances. This isn't to say that every frilla suffered equally, or that no master ever treated his frilla with some measure of kindness. Human relationships are complex and individual experiences varied, but the structural conditions of their existence, the legal framework, the economic reality, the social norms, created lives of profound vulnerability and hardship. And unlike some forms of historical suffering that we can at least say ended decisively, the legacy of treating certain humans as property echoes through history in ways that still affect us. Over the next 25 chapters, we'll walk through the actual texture of a frilla's existence. We'll examine the legal structures that defined her as a non-person. We'll follow her through a typical day's labour, season by season, task by exhausting task. We'll look at the physical evidence of what this life did to women's bodies. We'll consider the psychological reality of living without autonomy, without hope, without even the legal status to make contracts or testify to your own abuse. And we'll try to understand why history mostly forgot these women, why their stories seemed unremarkable to the people who could have recorded them, and why recovering their experience matters now. This is, admittedly, not cheerful content. But history, real history, is often uncomfortable. The details are boring in the sense that they're repetitive, unglamorous, and difficult to dramatise. But they're also revelatory. They show us what life was actually like for people who had no power, whose suffering was considered too ordinary to mention. So let's begin with the most fundamental aspect of the frilla's existence, her status in law, or rather, her complete lack of legal personhood. Chapter 1. The legal non-person. To understand a frilla's daily life, we must first understand what she was in the eyes of Norse law, because that legal status shaped every moment of her existence. Under the legal codes that governed Scandinavian society during the Viking Age, a thrall, an unfree person, was not legally a person at all. This wasn't a technicality or a semantic distinction. It had profound practical implications. A frilla could not own property. Not a cloak, not a comb, not a single coin. Anything in her possession belonged to her master, held by her only at his sufferance. This meant she could accumulate nothing, save nothing for future contingencies, build no security for herself. Every object she touched, every tool she used, every garment she wore, could be taken from her at any moment without explanation or recourse. She could not testify in legal proceedings. If she witnessed a crime, her testimony was worthless. If she was the victim of a crime, raped by someone other than her master, beaten, robbed, she could not bring suit. She had no standing before the thing, the assembly of free men where legal disputes were resolved. Other people might speak about her or on behalf of her master's interests, but her own voice had no legal weight. The law, quite literally, could not hear her. She could not refuse her master's sexual demands. This wasn't considered rape, because rape, as a legal concept, required violation of a person's rights, and a thrall had no such rights. Her body belonged to her master as surely as his cattle or his land. He could use it as he wished, whenever he wished, without consideration for her consent, her health, or her wishes. If she bore children from these encounters, and she frequently did, those children belonged entirely to the father. They had no legal connection to their mother beyond biological fact. Perhaps most chilling of all, her master could kill her with minimal legal consequences. The law required compensation if one person killed another person's thrall, not as punishment for murder, but as reimbursement for destroyed property, the way you might compensate someone for killing their ox. But a man who killed his own thrall faced no legal penalty whatsoever. He had destroyed his own property, which was considered his business alone. This legal framework created a reality that's difficult for us to fully comprehend from our modern perspective. Imagine living every moment knowing that the person who controls every aspect of your existence could end your life on a whim, with no consequence beyond losing the future labour you might have provided. Imagine having children and knowing that they are not yours in any legal sense, that they can be taken from you, sold away from you, raised by others while you watch helplessly. Imagine suffering assault and having no recourse, no appeal, no voice. The sagas occasionally preserve glimpses of this reality, though usually in passing. The Laxdæla saga mentions a woman referred to only as Olaf's frilla, her name unrecorded, her identity reduced to her function in a man's household. The Eyrbyggja saga casually notes that a man had his thrall killed for stealing with no more comment than you might give to putting down a dog. These weren't remarkable events worthy of a detailed description. They were ordinary, unremarkable, the background noise of daily life. Archaeological evidence supports this picture of legal non-personhood. Thrall burials, when they can be identified, are markedly different from free burials. They're often in marginal locations, away from proper cemeteries. They rarely contain grave goods, the objects meant to accompany the deceased into the afterlife. Some show signs of violent death, skull fractures, knife marks on bones, evidence of binding or restraint. The message is clear. These were people whose deaths were considered of little consequence, whose passage from life required no ceremony, whose eternal rest warranted no investment. So when we discuss a frilla's daily routine, the water hauling, the grinding, the textile work, the cooking, we must remember that every task was performed in this context of legal non-existence. She was property doing her owner's bidding, and this reality coloured everything. It meant that exhaustion was irrelevant. It meant that injury required no accommodation. It meant that every day began with the fundamental, inescapable fact of her powerlessness. Chapter 2. The Morning Wake. Before dawn, the frilla's day began in darkness. During the long northern winter, sunrise might not come until 9 or 10 in the morning, and even then it would be a weak grey light that barely penetrated the smoky interior of the longhouse. But the household's work could not wait for dawn. Fires had to be rekindled, animals had to be tended, breakfast had to be prepared. And this work fell first to those lowest in the household hierarchy. Picture, if you will, a longhouse in January. Outside, temperatures have dropped well below freezing. Inside, the central hearth has burned low during the night, reducing to embers that provide minimal warmth. The interior is pitch black except for this dim orange glow. Smoke hangs in the air, never fully dissipating even with the hole in the roof designed to vent it. The walls, made of timber or turf, trap the cold. Condensation freezes on interior surfaces. Your breath makes clouds in the air. The frilla sleeps, if sleep is the right word for this exhausted unconsciousness, on the floor near the kitchen end of the longhouse. Not in the sleeping benches that line the walls where family members rest, but on the cold earth, perhaps with a thin hide or worn blanket, almost certainly inadequate against the penetrating cold. She might be near other thralls if the household has several, or she might be alone. Either way, her location is strategic, close to the kitchen area so she can respond immediately to work demands, and positioned where the master can find her easily if he has nighttime desires. When she wakes, roused by habit, by cold, by the household stirring, or by a kick from someone already awake, there is no gentle transition from sleep to consciousness. There is no lying in bed for a few minutes, no stretching, no gradual awakening. There is only the immediate necessity of work. The fire must be brought back to life before the embers die completely, because starting a fire from scratch with flint and steel and tinder is time-consuming and may result in punishment if breakfast is delayed. She rises in total darkness, navigating by memory and by the faint glow of embers. Her body aches from yesterday's labour and from the hard sleeping surface. In winter, she likely suffers from chilblains, painful inflammation of the fingers and toes caused by a repeated exposure to cold. Her joints are stiff. If she's given birth recently, and pregnancy was a frequent occurrence for frilla, she may still be recovering from the trauma of childbirth, expected to return to full labour within days or weeks regardless of tearing, infection, or blood loss. She must move quietly, because waking the master or mistress unnecessarily might bring a slap or a kick. But she must also move quickly, because lateness in starting the day's work is similarly punishable. It's a narrow path to navigate, and she navigates it in darkness, in cold, in pain, with no prospect of rest for another 16 or 18 hours. This moment, this waking in darkness, this immediate transition from unconsciousness to labour, represents something essential about the frilla's existence. She had no control over her sleep. She could not decide to rest when exhausted. She could not sleep late to recover from illness. The master might summon her at any point during the night for sexual purposes, disrupting what little sleep she managed. Children crying, household emergencies, a guest arriving late. Any of these could cut short her rest. And in the morning, no matter how little sleep she'd managed, work began when work began. Archaeological evidence from sites like Leisure in Denmark shows us the layout of these longhouses and confirms this sleeping arrangement. The high seat, the place of honour where the household head and his wife sat, occupied the centre of the longhouse. Family members slept on benches along the walls. The kitchen area and service areas were at one end. Artefacts found in these service areas include simple tools, worn-out equipment, and occasionally the bones of people buried without ceremony or grave goods, suggesting these were where servants, slaves, and frilla spent their time, and, eventually, were disposed of. So the next time you hit the snooze button on your alarm or decide to sleep in on a weekend or wake naturally when your body has had enough rest, consider this. A frilla never made that choice. Not once in her entire life. Every morning began in darkness, in cold, in pain, because her life was not her own, and rest was not a right but a privilege she was never granted. Chapter 3. Lighting the Longhouse. Once awake, the frilla's first task was to bring light and warmth to a household still, deep in winter darkness. This wasn't a matter of flipping a switch or striking a match. It was a complex, time-consuming process that, if done incorrectly, could result in anything from a day of cold meals to burning down the entire structure with everyone inside. The central hearth would still have embers from the previous night. Maintaining a continuous fire was far easier than starting a new one each day. But embers don't provide much light, and they certainly don't heat a longhouse that's 60 feet long and 15 feet wide. The frilla would need to carefully add fuel to bring the fire back to full strength. Small twigs first, then larger sticks, then logs, each addition timed carefully to catch from the previous layer without smothering the flames. This required judgment. Too much fuel too quickly would smother the embers, too little, and the fire might die before catching properly. The wood itself posed variables. Wet wood from outdoor storage would steam and smoke before burning, requiring more coaxing. Different woods burned differently. Pine caught quickly, but burned fast and spat sparks, while hardwoods like oak burned slowly and steadily but took longer to ignite. The frilla needed to know these things, to judge by sight and feel and sound whether the fire was catching properly or needed adjustment. And all of this in darkness, by the light of embers alone. A mistake could mean starting over with flint and steel, a laborious process that could take several minutes of striking sparks into prepared tinder, coaxing those sparks into flame, building that flame into something that could light the hearth. This delay would push back the entire household schedule, delaying the morning meal, which would anger the master and mistress. But fire was only part of the lighting problem. The longhouse had no windows. Openings would let in precious heat and create structural weaknesses. The smoke hole in the roof provided minimal light even in daytime, so additional light sources were needed, and these were the frilla's responsibility to maintain. Oil lamps, usually shallow stone or ceramic bowls filled with seal oil or fish oil, with a wick of twisted plant fibre, provided pools of flickering yellow light. Each needed to be checked, refilled if low, the wick trimmed if it was smoking badly or burning unevenly. Seal oil and fish oil were valuable commodities not to be wasted. The frilla needed to use enough to provide necessary light, but not so much that she'd be accused of extravagance or theft. The smell of these burning oils would permeate the longhouse, a fishy, acrid smell that mixed with wood smoke, cooking smells, and the odour of unwashed bodies to create the characteristic atmosphere of a Viking Age dwelling. For someone living in it constantly, the smell would become normal, unnoticeable. For a modern person transported back, it would be almost overwhelming. The dark reveal here is what this constant work with fire and smoke did to the frilla's body over time. Skeletal remains from excavated Viking Age sites show that people who worked in kitchen areas suffered from chronic respiratory conditions at much higher rates than the general population. Constant smoke exposure inflamed lungs and airways, leading to chronic coughs, difficulty breathing and shortened lifespans. Chemical analysis of bones can reveal carbon deposits absorbed from smoke exposure. Burns were also common, working with open fires in the dark, often while exhausted, while managing heavy cauldrons and hot metal implements, led to frequent accidents. Skeletal evidence shows healed burn injuries, particularly on hands and arms, with some burns severe enough to have caused permanent damage. The sagas occasionally mention slaves or servants with scarred hands, described matter-of-factly as part of their appearance. These weren't dramatic injuries worth detailed description, just the normal outcome of years spent managing fire in difficult conditions. And then there was the ever-present danger of house fires. A longhouse fire could kill everyone inside within minutes. The structure was wood, turf, and thatch, all flammable. The central hearth was an open fire not contained in any way. Sparks could land on bedding, on stored hay, on wooden walls. A lamp tipped over could spread burning oil across a floor. The frilla, responsible for maintaining fires and lights, bore the psychological burden of knowing that a mistake could result in mass death, and that she would be blamed, punished, perhaps killed for the error. So every morning in the dark, the frilla coaxed fire back to life, lit lamps, managed smoke, and brought light to a household that would barely acknowledge the work involved. It was skilled labour performed under difficult conditions with serious consequences for failure, and it was just the beginning of her day. Chapter 4. The Hierarchy of the Household. With the longhouse lit and warming, the household would begin to wake and stir, and as people emerged from sleep, the strict hierarchy of Norse domestic life would become visible in 100 small ways. For the frilla, understanding her place in this hierarchy wasn't simply a matter of social niceties, it was essential to survival. At the top of the household structure stood the husbondi, the master, the male head of the household. His word was law within his domain. He made all significant decisions, controlled all property, and held absolute authority over every person under his roof. Below him in authority, but still significantly elevated above the frilla, stood the husfreyja, his legal wife. She managed the household's daily operations, directed the work of servants and slaves, controlled access to storerooms, and held significant power within the domestic sphere. The children of the legal marriage occupied the next level. They were free persons, heirs to property and family reputation, treated with the deference due to their status even when, They were quite young. Any male thralls in the household had complex standing. They were unfree but male, which in the profoundly patriarchal Norse culture gave them certain standing above women, even if they were enslaved. Craftsmen, if the household had any, blacksmiths, carpenters, specialised workers, might be free or freed and held status according to their skills. And then, at the very bottom of this pyramid, stood the frilla. She was unfree, female, and in the profoundly awkward position of bearing her master's children while being subordinate to his legal wife. This created a domestic situation fraught with tension and potential violence. Consider the psychological reality for the Usfreyja, the legal wife. Her husband regularly sleeps with another woman in the same household. This woman may bear children who, while not full heirs, are still acknowledged as the husband's offspring and may be raised alongside the legitimate children. The wife has legal and practical authority over this woman, but cannot remove her without the husband's consent and may face opposition if she tries. The frilla represents both a sexual rival and a constant reminder that the husband's desires override the wife's comfort. Now consider the frilla's position in this dynamic. She must serve the wife, take orders from her, accept correction and punishment, all while simultaneously sharing the wife's husband's bed. She must navigate the wife's resentment while having no power to alter the situation. She cannot refuse the master's sexual advances, but each advance deepens the wife's hostility toward her. These sagas preserve glimpses of this tension. The Laxdæla saga tells of Vigdis, a wife who successfully demanded that her husband sell his frilla and the frilla's children after the woman bore the husband's son. The husband complied, and the frilla and children were sold away, separated from each other and from the household, their fates unrecorded. The saga treats this as a reasonable response to domestic disharmony, a wife asserting her rightful primacy. The domestic abuse this situation enabled was both vertical and horizontal. The master could beat the frilla for any reason, or no reason. This was considered normal discipline of property. But the wife could also order her beaten, could assign the hardest and most dangerous tasks, could deprive her of food, could make her life miserable in dozens of ways. The legitimate children, taking their cue from their mother, might abuse the frilla as well. Even other thralls might participate in tormenting someone even lower than themselves. A grim dynamic where the nearly powerless exercise what little power they have against the completely powerless. Archaeological evidence of this hierarchy appears in burial practices and in the distribution of artifacts within longhouses. High-status individuals were buried with elaborate grave goods, weapons, jewellery, fine clothing, sometimes servants killed to accompany them. Middle-status graves contained fewer but still significant items. Thrall graves, when identifiable, contained almost nothing, and were often located away from proper cemeteries. Within longhouses, fine objects, combs, brooches, imported items, cluster in the high-status areas. The kitchen and service areas contain only crude tools and broken items. The psychological toll of this hierarchical structure on the frilla was profound. She had to maintain situational awareness at all times, tracking who was nearby, who might need something, who might be in a bad mood and looking for someone to punish. She had to read social cues instantly and respond appropriately. Too slow, and she'd be beaten for laziness. Too forward, and she'd be beaten for presumption. She had to make herself useful enough to be retained, but not so visible that she provoked the wife's jealousy. Modern workplace hierarchies, with all their stresses and power dynamics, pale in comparison. In a modern job you can quit. You can report abuse. You have legal protections, however imperfect. You can at least conceive of changing your situation. The frilla had none of these options. The hierarchy was immutable, backed by law and custom and force, and she had to navigate it successfully every single day, from the moment she woke until the moment she collapsed into unconsciousness, because failure meant pain or death. Chapter 5. Water. The daily burden. With the household stirring and the fire burning, one of the frilla's early morning tasks would be hauling water. This sounds simple. Water is something we access by turning a tap. But in the Viking Age, obtaining water for household use was a time-consuming, physically demanding task that had to be repeated multiple times daily, in all weather, year-round. And like most essential but unglamorous tasks, it fell disproportionately to those lowest in the household hierarchy. The source of water varied by location. Some fortunate households had wells, deep pits lined with stone or wood that accessed groundwater, but digging and maintaining wells was expensive and required specific geological conditions. More commonly, households depended on streams, springs or lakes. This meant that water had to be carried from the source to the household, a distance that could be considerable if the longhouse was sited on high ground for defence or drainage. The water container would be a wooden bucket, probably holding several gallons when full. Wood was shaped by hand, bound with metal hoops if the household could afford them, or simply carved from a single piece. A full bucket of water weighs roughly 8 pounds per gallon, so a 3-gallon bucket would weigh about 24 pounds. This doesn't sound like much, but consider that the frilla might need to make this trip 10 or 15 times in a day to supply water for cooking, cleaning, laundry and drinking for an entire household. In summer, the path to the water source might be muddy, slippery, overgrown with vegetation. The stream banks could be steep and treacherous. Insects would swarm, mosquitoes in enormous numbers in the boggy areas of Scandinavia, making outdoor work a constant battle against biting and stinging. The frilla would be expected to move quickly despite these obstacles, because water was needed constantly and delays disrupted the household's work schedule. In winter, the difficulties multiplied exponentially. Streams could freeze partially or completely, requiring the frilla to break through ice to reach flowing water. The path would be icy, and carrying 24 pounds of water while navigating ice-covered ground is an excellent way to fall and injure yourself. Spilled water meant another trip and probably a beating for wasting time. If her hands got wet while breaking ice or filling the bucket, the cold could cause severe pain, and if repeated often enough, permanent damage from repeated mild frostbite. The physical toll of this daily water hauling shows up clearly in skeletal remains from Viking Age sites. Bioarchaeologists examining skeletons from excavated settlements can identify characteristic patterns of stress on bones that indicate repetitive heavy lifting with particular posture. Women's skeletons from low-status burials show severe wear on cervical and thoracic vertebrae, the neck and upper back, consistent with years of carrying heavy loads. Shoulder joints show degenerative changes from the constant stress. Some skeletons show spinal compression fractures, indicating that the load sometimes exceeded what the skeletal structure could safely support. A particular condition that modern orthopedists would recognise appears in some of these skeletal remains. Severe scoliosis and uneven wear patterns suggesting that water carriers developed asymmetric strength and skeletal adaptation from always carrying buckets on the same side. By the time a frilla reached her 30s, if she lived that long, her spine might be visibly curved, her gait uneven, chronic pain her constant companion. The sagas occasionally mention old servants or slaves who were bent or crooked, described matter-of-factly as part of their appearance. But the physical damage wasn't limited to skeletal structure. Carrying heavy loads regularly causes soft tissue damage, torn muscles, chronic tendinitis, damaged cartilage. Without modern medical care, these injuries didn't heal properly. Inflammation became chronic, pain became normal, range of motion decreased. By middle age, if a frilla survived that long, she might be partially incapacitated, unable to lift her arms above shoulder height, unable to turn her head fully, every movement accompanied by pain. The excavations at Birka, the famous Viking Age trading centre in Sweden, included numerous burials of low-status individuals. Among these were several female skeletons showing the characteristic damage pattern: compressed vertebrae, damaged shoulder joints, and evidence of chronic malnutrition despite living in a wealthy trading centre. These women probably carried water, carried cargo, hauled supplies from boats to warehouses, their bodies slowly destroyed by labour that the society considered too menial to warrant any special notice. So when you turn on your tap this evening and fill a glass with water, consider what that simple act would have required in the Viking Age. Consider walking several hundred yards to a freezing stream, breaking through ice, filling a heavy wooden bucket, carrying it back over treacherous ground, and repeating this process 10 or 15 times, every single day, until your spine compressed and your shoulders gave out, and your body simply couldn't do it anymore. And then consider that this was just one task among dozens that the frilla was expected to perform every day, without complaint, without rest, without hope that it would ever end. Chapter 6. Grinding Grain. The Endless Circle. With water hauled and the household's morning routine underway, the frilla would turn to one of the most time-consuming and physically punishing tasks in the pre-industrial household: grinding grain for bread. We take flour for granted. You buy it in bags, already ground to consistent fineness, ready to use. But every loaf of bread consumed in a Viking Age household began with someone grinding grain by hand, and that someone was almost always a woman of low status. The tool for this work was the rotary quern, a simple but ingenious device consisting of two circular stones, each perhaps 18 inches in diameter and 3 to 4 inches thick. The lower stone, called the quern stone, sat stationary. It had a slightly convex upper surface and a central hole. The upper stone, called the hand stone, had a corresponding concave lower surface and a hole through its centre, plus a wooden handle set into its edge. Grain was poured into the central hole, and as the upper stone was rotated, the grain was crushed between the two surfaces and emerged as flour around the edges. This sounds straightforward, but the reality was gruelling. The upper stone weighed 30 to 40 pounds. Rotating it required continuous circular motion of the arms and upper body, a movement that had to be maintained for hours. The frilla would typically kneel or crouch beside the quern, grasping the wooden handle with both hands, pushing and pulling in an endless circle. The stone had to turn steadily. Too fast and the grain wouldn't grind properly. Too slow and the work would take even longer than it already did. For a household of 8 to 10 people, producing enough flour for the day's bread might require 2 to 3 hours of grinding. This wasn't a task that could be done occasionally. It had to be done every single day because bread was the staple food and had to be fresh. In wealthier households with multiple thralls, this work might be shared, but in smaller households, it fell to a single woman, day after day after day. The physical position required for this work was itself punishing. Kneeling or crouching for hours placed enormous stress on knee joints and ankle joints. The circular motion, repeated thousands of times, stressed shoulder joints, elbow joints, and wrists in specific repetitive ways. And unlike modern repetitive stress injuries that develop from relatively light work done in poor ergonomic positions, this was heavy work. You were moving 30 pounds of stone in a circle, fighting friction and inertia for hours at a stretch. Archaeological evidence shows us exactly what this did to women's bodies. Skeletal remains from Viking Age sites show characteristic patterns of arthritis in the knees, particularly severe in women from low-status burials. The joint surfaces show erosion and bone spurs consistent with decades of kneeling on hard surfaces. Wrist and elbow joints show similar degenerative changes. Some skeletons show evidence of compression injuries in the wrists from the constant pushing force required to turn the heavy stone. But perhaps most disturbing is the evidence of silicosis, a lung disease caused by inhaling fine particles of stone dust. As the quern stones rotated against each other, grinding grain, they also ground against each other, releasing microscopic particles of stone into the air. The woman kneeling over the quern, her face close to her work, would inhale this dust constantly during her hours of grinding. Over years, this stone dust accumulated in the lungs, causing scarring and inflammation that made breathing progressively more difficult. The condition was incurable and eventually fatal. Modern analysis of skeletal remains can detect silicosis by examining lung tissue when it's preserved, or by identifying characteristic changes in the ribs where scarred lungs pulled on bone. Several skeletons from Viking Age sites show evidence consistent with this disease. One study of remains from the Swedish site of Birka identified multiple female skeletons with indicators of chronic respiratory disease, particularly among those buried without grave goods in areas suggesting low social status. The sagas occasionally preserve glimpses of this reality. The Landnama Bok, which records the settlement of Iceland, mentions in passing that a certain household had 2 quern stones always working to feed the large number of people. This tells us that grinding was constant work, and that households with sufficient means had multiple women grinding simultaneously. The Egil saga mentions a thrall woman whose hands were ruined from grinding, described casually as one might note any other physical characteristic. The quern stones themselves survive in the archaeological record in large numbers. They're heavy, durable, and were valuable enough that broken ones were often repaired rather than discarded. Interestingly, analysis of wear patterns on surviving querns shows that stones found in high-status areas of longhouses typically show more, even moderate wear. These were likely used occasionally, perhaps by the household's free women when there were no thralls available. But querns found in service areas show extreme uneven wear, suggesting they were used constantly, to the point where the stones wore down unevenly and became less efficient. These were the querns the thralls used, grinding grain hour after hour until the stones themselves bore witness to the endless labour. The monotony of this work deserves mention as well. Grinding grain is not intellectually engaging, it's not creative, it's not varied, it's the same circular motion, the same dull scraping sound of stone on stone, the same posture for hours. Your mind has nothing to focus on except the discomfort in your knees, the burning in your shoulders, the dust in your throat. You cannot hurry it. The grain grinds at the rate it grinds. You cannot take breaks. The flour is needed for bread that must be baked, and delays disrupt the entire household schedule. So picture a frilla in her early 20s, kneeling beside a quern stone in the dim, smoky light of a longhouse. Her knees ache from the cold stone floor. Her shoulders burn from the constant circular motion. Stone dust coats her throat and lungs. The handle has worn calluses on her palms. She has been doing this for 2 hours and will continue for another hour, and then she'll do it again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, for as long as her body holds out. And when it finally gives out, when her lungs are too scarred to breathe, when her knees can no longer bear her weight, when her wrists can no longer turn the stone, she will be considered used up, useless, and disposed of accordingly. This was the price of bread in the Viking Age, paid by the bodies of women who had no choice in the matter. Chapter 7. The Sexual Availability Clause. We need to address directly the aspect of the frilla's existence that defined her role, but is often glossed over in popular depictions. Her status as sexually available to her master at all times, without consent, without the ability to refuse. This wasn't a romantic relationship, despite how television shows and novels sometimes portray it. It was systematic sexual exploitation, embedded in the legal and social structure of Norse society. Under Viking Age law and custom, a man who owned a female thrall had complete sexual access to her. This wasn't considered rape, because rape, as a legal concept, required violating someone's rights, and thralls had no such rights. Their bodies were property, and a man using his own property as he wished was not only legal, but entirely unremarkable. These sagas, which preserve our most detailed narratives from this period, mention sexual relationships between masters and thralls with the same casual tone they might use for describing the purchase of livestock. For the frilla, This meant that at any time, while she was working, while she was exhausted from 16 hours of labour, while she was ill, while she was recovering from childbirth, the master could summon her for sex. She slept in areas of the longhouse where she was accessible for this purpose. There was no privacy, no ability to refuse, no consideration for her physical or emotional state. Her body was not her own. Pregnancy was a frequent result of this systematic sexual access. Without effective contraception, a woman regularly subjected to sexual intercourse would become pregnant frequently. Modern demographic studies suggest that women in pre-industrial societies without birth control might experience 8 to 10 pregnancies over their reproductive lifetimes, though many of these would end in miscarriage or stillbirth. For a frilla, pregnancy offered no protection from either sexual demands or labour demands. The archaeological record provides disturbing evidence of what this meant for women's bodies. Skeletal remains of young women from low-status burials frequently show signs of pelvic trauma consistent with difficult childbirths. The pelvis might show fractures or stress indicators, where the bones separated during labour. Some skeletons show evidence of obstetric fistula, a devastating injury where the tissues between the vagina and bladder or rectum tear during prolonged obstructed labour, causing permanent incontinence and often infection. In the modern world, obstetric fistula is treatable with surgery. In the Viking Age, it was a permanent, incurable condition that would have made the woman's life even more miserable than it already was, constantly leaking urine or faeces, suffering from chronic infections, with no medical treatment available. Yet she would still be expected to work, because her value to the household depended on her labour, and unfree women didn't have the option of rest or recovery. Maternal mortality was high across all classes in the Viking Age, but it was especially high among thrall women. They were typically malnourished compared to free women, which increased pregnancy complications. They received little or no care during labour. A free woman might have experienced midwives attending her, but a thrall was more likely to give birth alone or with minimal assistance, and be expected to return to work within days. If complications arose, they simply weren't treated. The sagas occasionally mention this reality in passing. The Eyrbyggja saga notes that a man's frilla died in childbirth, and he got another one soon after, with the same casualness you might mention replacing a broken tool. The implication is clear. The woman was replaceable, her death unremarkable, the inconvenience to the master minimal because the slave markets provided a ready supply of new women. But we should also consider the psychological reality of this situation. Imagine living with the knowledge that your body is not yours to control, that at any moment you might be summoned for sexual use regardless of your wishes, your physical state, or your emotional capacity. Imagine bearing children knowing that they are not yours in any legal sense, that they can be taken from you, sold away from you, with no recourse. Imagine the relationship between a frilla and her children. She might love them desperately, but she had no legal bond to them, no ability to protect them, no assurance she would be allowed to raise them. Some historical sources suggest that masters sometimes developed affection for their frilla or for the children they bore together. The legal codes made provision for acknowledging such children as legitimate heirs if the master chose to do so. Some men freed their frilla and married them formally. But these were exceptions, not rules, and they depended entirely on the master's voluntary choice. The frilla had no recourse, no appeal, no way to improve her situation except through the master's goodwill. The physical evidence of this systematic exploitation appears in the archaeological record in other ways too. Chemical analysis of bones can reveal nutritional stress during pregnancy, periods when the mother's body was depleted of calcium and other nutrients to build the fetus, indicating inadequate diet during pregnancy. This shows up as horizontal lines of decreased bone density that correlate with pregnancy timing. Multiple such lines in a single skeleton tell us that women experience multiple pregnancies while malnourished. One particularly well-documented skeleton from a Viking Age site in Norway shows evidence of at least 6 pregnancies based on pelvic scarring and bone chemistry, chronic malnutrition, severe spinal damage from heavy labour, and death in the early 30s from causes that included infection. There were no grave goods, and the burial location suggested low status. This was almost certainly a thrall woman, probably a frilla, whose body was used for labour and reproduction until it gave out completely. So when we discuss the daily life of a frilla, the water hauling, the grinding, the cooking, the cleaning, we must remember that overlaying all of this was the constant reality of sexual availability without consent. Every task was performed with this knowledge. Every interaction with the master carried this possibility. Every pregnancy represented not a chosen family expansion, but an inevitable consequence of systematic sexual exploitation. This was not romance. This was not a relationship. This was exploitation embedded so deeply in the social structure that it was considered entirely normal, entirely unremarkable, entirely legal. Chapter 8. Cooking in smoke and darkness. Once grain was ground into flour and water was hauled, and the household was fully awake, the frilla's attention would turn to one of her central responsibilities, cooking. But cooking in a Viking Age longhouse bore almost no resemblance to modern kitchen work. There were no stoves with controlled heat, no ventilation beyond a hole in the roof, no running water, no refrigeration, and no electric light. Cooking meant managing fire, heavy iron cauldrons, scalding liquids, and dangerous implements, all in a smoky, dimly lit environment that would be almost intolerable to a modern person. The cooking hearth was the central fire that ran down the middle of the longhouse. It wasn't a contained stove or fireplace, but rather a long rectangular pit or slightly raised platform where fire burned directly on the ground, perhaps lined with stones to contain it somewhat. Over this open fire hung iron cauldrons suspended from chains or tripods. These cauldrons might hold stews, soups, porridges, the thick, starchy one-pot meals that characterise Norse cuisine. They were heavy even when empty, and when filled with food and liquid, they could weigh 50 pounds or more. The frilla had to manage these cauldrons constantly. Food had to be stirred to prevent burning or sticking. The temperature had to be adjusted by adding or removing fuel from beneath the cauldron, a delicate process requiring judgment. Too hot and food burned, too cool and it didn't cook through. Lifting a 50-pound cauldron of boiling liquid off a fire requires significant strength and carries obvious danger. Splashing boiling stew or porridge onto your hands or arms causes severe burns, and in the Viking Age there was no effective burn treatment beyond possibly cooling the burn with water and hoping infection didn't set in. The smoke from the cooking fire was a constant presence. The longhouse had a smoke hole in the roof, but smoke doesn't exit cleanly upward. It swirls, hangs in the air, gets blown back down by wind, accumulates in layers. The frilla working over the cooking fire would be enveloped in smoke constantly. Her eyes would water and sting. Her throat would burn. She would cough habitually, a chronic smoker's cough despite never smoking tobacco. Over years, this constant smoke exposure caused severe respiratory damage. Modern studies of skeletal remains from Viking Age sites consistently show respiratory disease indicators in skeletons from low-status burials, particularly female skeletons found in areas suggesting they were servants or slaves. The ribs sometimes show characteristic thickening, where chronically inflamed lungs pulled on the bone attachments. Chemical analysis can detect carbon deposits absorbed into bone over years of smoke exposure. Some skeletons show evidence of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, lungs so damaged that breathing became progressively more difficult, leading eventually to respiratory failure. But smoke wasn't the only hazard in the cooking area. Burns were extremely common. The frilla worked with open flames, with iron implements that conducted heat fiercely, with boiling liquids, all while tired, often while navigating around other people working in the same cramped space. Skeletal evidence frequently shows healed burn injuries, particularly on forearms and hands, the parts of the body most exposed while cooking, Some burns were severe enough to damage bone beneath the burned skin, leaving permanent scarring visible in skeletal analysis. The sagas occasionally mention servants or slaves with burn scars, usually in passing as part of physical description. She had marks from fire on her arms, appears in one saga, noted with the same casualness as describing hair colour. These weren't heroic battle scars or marks of honour. They were the mundane result of working in dangerous conditions without protective equipment, without adequate lighting, while exhausted from overwork. The actual food being prepared deserves mention as well. The Norse diet was heavy on grains, dairy products, preserved fish, and occasional meat. Fresh vegetables were available only in summer. Much of the diet consisted of things that needed to be boiled or baked into submission. Tough cuts of meat from older animals, dried fish that needed hours of cooking to become edible, grains boiled into porridge or baked into dense, heavy bread. This meant long cooking times, constant attention, and extensive preparation work. Food preparation began long before cooking. Fish needed to be cleaned and prepared, though much was eaten dried or preserved. Meat needed butchering. Grains needed grinding, as we've discussed. Dairy needed processing. Milk had to be collected from animals, processed into various forms of preserved dairy products, since fresh milk spoiled quickly without refrigeration. All of this labour-intensive work fell primarily to the frilla. And there was a psychological dimension to this work that we shouldn't overlook. The frilla prepared food she would eat last and least. She spent hours cooking, surrounded by the smells of food, while often hungry herself due to her position at the bottom of the household's eating hierarchy. She served the master, the mistress, the legitimate children, any guests. Everyone ate before she did, and she received whatever was left, which might be scraps, might be the burnt or inferior portions, might be barely enough to sustain life. This created a particular cruelty, working constantly with food while chronically malnourished, preparing meals for others while your own body slowly starved. Skeletal evidence supports this picture. Bone chemistry from low-status female skeletons shows chronic nutritional deficiency, despite these women living in households that had adequate food. They prepared it, served it, cleaned up after it, but didn't eat adequately themselves. The excavations at Leisure in Denmark revealed a cooking area in one longhouse that included layers of ash, fire-damaged stones, and fragments of cooking vessels. Nearby were found skeletal remains of a young woman buried without ceremony or grave goods. Chemical analysis showed severe nutritional deficiency and respiratory damage. The proximity of this burial to the kitchen area suggests this was a woman who died while serving the household, someone whose death was considered unremarkable, enough that she was simply buried nearby rather than in a proper cemetery. She had spent her life cooking in smoke and darkness, and when she died, probably in her 20s, she was disposed of with minimal ceremony and immediately replaced. So the next time you cook a meal in your well-lit, well-ventilated kitchen, with precise temperature control and running water, and the ability to step away whenever you choose, consider what that same task required in the Viking Age. Consider standing over an open fire in a smoke-filled darkness, managing heavy cauldrons of scalding liquid, while your lungs slowly scarred and your arms bore burn after burn, preparing food you would barely share in, working until your body gave out completely. Chapter 9. Textile Production. The Winter Trap. As daylight hours shortened and winter settled over Scandinavia, outdoor work became increasingly difficult or impossible. The fields lay frozen. Animals huddled in their shelters, requiring minimal tending. But household work didn't stop simply because the weather turned brutal. Instead, it shifted indoors to tasks that could be done in the cramped, dark, smoky interior of the longhouse. Chief among these was textile production, a category of work that consumed countless hours and fell disproportionately to women, and especially to unfree women. Textile production in the Viking Age wasn't a matter of going to a store and buying clothes. Every thread had to be hand-spun. Every piece of fabric had to be hand-woven. Every garment had to be hand-sewn. For a household of 8 to 10 people, clothing requirements were substantial. Undergarments, outer garments, cloaks, bedding, bags, all made from wool or linen, all requiring replacement as they wore out. The labour involved was staggering. The process began with raw materials. Wool came from the household's sheep, sheared once a year and stored until needed. The wool first had to be cleaned, picked through by hand to remove dirt, vegetation, insect debris, anything that had gotten tangled in the fleece. This was tedious work, requiring good light, which was precisely what the longhouse didn't have during the winter months. The frilla would sit in the dim, smoky light from the hearth or from oil lamps, picking through greasy wool for hours, her hands becoming chapped and sore from the lanolin in the wool combined with the constant cold. Once cleaned, the wool had to be carded, combed with wooden or bone combs to align the fibres and prepare them for spinning. This required rhythmic, repetitive arm movements, pulling the wool through the comb teeth again and again. After carding came spinning, perhaps the most time-consuming part of the entire process. Using a hand spindle, a wooden shaft with a weighted whirl, the spinner would draw out wool fibres and twist them into thread through a combination of hand movements and the spinning weight's momentum. Spinning was skilled work requiring practice and attention, but it was also endless. To spin enough thread for a single garment might require 40 to 60 hours of work. For a household's annual clothing needs, the spinning requirements ran into the hundreds of hours, and because thread needs varied, fine thread for undergarments, coarse thread for outerwear, different weights for different purposes, the spinner couldn't simply fall into a mindless rhythm, but had to constantly adjust technique to match requirements. The physical toll of this work shows up clearly in skeletal remains. Women from Viking Age sites frequently show characteristic wear patterns in thumb and finger joints from the repeated motion of spinning, pinching fibre, drawing it out, managing the spindle. The wrists show repetitive stress damage from the constant rotation. Shoulders and upper back show strain indicators from the sustained posture required for spinning. You couldn't slump or relax because that affected thread quality. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of textile work was that it was never finished. A woman could spin all day, every day for months, and there would still be more wool to process, more thread to spin, more fabric to weave, more garments to repair. It was literally endless work, because textiles wore out and needed replacement, and there was no other source for them. If the household's textile production fell behind, people would lack adequate clothing, which in the harsh Scandinavian climate could mean serious hardship or even death from exposure. Once thread was spun, it had to be woven into fabric. This required a loom, typically a vertical warp-weighted loom that leaned against the longhouse wall. The loom was large, perhaps 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide, and setting one up for weaving was itself a substantial project, requiring threading hundreds of warp threads, the vertical threads, and attaching weights to keep them under tension. The weft threads, horizontal, were then woven through the warp using a wooden sword and heddle rods, creating fabric gradually, inch by inch. Weaving was physically demanding in different ways from spinning. The weaver stood or sat for hours, arms raised to shoulder height or above, passing the weft thread back and forth, beating each row into place with the wooden sword. This created its own pattern of repetitive stress, shoulder damage, upper back strain, hand and wrist problems from gripping tools. And like spinning, it was slow. Weaving a single piece of fabric large enough for a cloak might take a week or more of steady work. The sagas occasionally mention textile production quotas, expected amounts of fabric that a household's women, particularly the unfree women, were supposed to produce in a season. Failing to meet these quotas brought punishment. The Gragas, an Icelandic law code written down in the 12th century but preserving earlier customs, specifies that a slave woman should produce a certain amount of cloth annually, or face reduced rations. The message was clear: produce or starve. Archaeological evidence of textile production appears at virtually every Viking Age site in the form of spindle whorls, the weighted part of the hand spindle, and loom weights, the stone or clay weights that tension the warp threads. At sites like Birka and Hedeby, major trading centres, excavations have uncovered hundreds of spindle whorls, suggesting that textile production was happening on a massive scale, presumably performed largely by unfree women producing cloth both for household use and for trade. But we should also consider the psychological dimension of this work, particularly during the long winter months. The frilla would be trapped indoors, in the dark, smoky longhouse, sitting for hours, spinning thread or standing at the loom, performing the same motions over and over. There was no radio, no television, no conversation beyond what the household provided, and as the lowest status person present, she couldn't expect much friendly interaction. There was only the endless work, the smoke, the cold, the darkness, and the knowledge that tomorrow would be exactly the same. The winter months in northern Scandinavia included as little as 4 to 6 hours of week daylight. For roughly 18 to 20 hours each day it was dark. Work had to continue by firelight or lamplight, which was inadequate and made the already tedious work even more difficult. The psychological toll of spending months in near darkness, performing endless repetitive labour, cannot be overstated. Some historical sources hint at what they called winter madness, a kind of psychological breakdown associated with the long, dark months of confinement. One skeleton excavated from a Viking Age farm in Iceland shows evidence that has puzzled researchers. Severe malnutrition, despite living in what appeared to be a prosperous household, repetitive stress damage in hands and wrists consistent with textile work, and what appeared to be an intentional death during winter. The skeleton showed no evidence of disease that would have killed her, no wounds from violence, but was found in a location suggesting she had walked out into the snow and not returned. Whether this was suicide or simply giving up and letting the cold take her, we cannot know. But it suggests the psychological breaking point that winter confinement and endless labour could produce. So when you think of the romantic image of Viking women spinning by the firelight, understand that the reality was months of endless, tedious, physically punishing labour in smoke-filled darkness, producing thread and fabric that would never be yours, wearing out your body through repetitive stress, trapped indoors with no escape, no variation, no hope that it would ever end until your hands simply couldn't work anymore and you were discarded as useless. Chapter 10. Washing in ice water. Among all the tasks that defined a frilla's existence, laundry stands out as particularly brutal. This wasn't a matter of loading clothes into a machine, adding detergent and pressing a button. Washing textiles in the Viking Age required hauling water, preparing harsh soap, manually agitating and beating fabric, and doing all of this in conditions that range from uncomfortable in summer to genuinely dangerous in winter. And like most household tasks, it fell primarily to the lowest status women. Laundry couldn't be done daily in the way we think of it today. Textiles were too valuable, too labour-intensive to produce, to risk washing them frequently. Most people owned very few changes of clothes, perhaps 2 or 3 garments total, plus a cloak and possibly a second pair of undergarments if they were fortunate. But these items still needed washing eventually, when they became too soiled or odorous to tolerate, and bedding needed washing as well, as did kitchen cloths and other household textiles. The washing process typically took place at a stream or lakeside, not in the house itself. There simply wasn't space or adequate water drainage inside the longhouse. This meant that regardless of weather, the frilla would need to gather the dirty textiles, haul them to the water source, along with whatever equipment was needed, and spend hours working outdoors exposed to the elements. The soap used for washing was made from wood ash, mixed with water to create lye, a caustic alkaline solution that could cut through grease and dirt. Making lye soap was itself a process. Wood ash had to be collected from the hearth, adding another daily task to the frilla's endless list, mixed with water in the right proportions, and sometimes heated or processed further to increase concentration. The resulting solution was effective at cleaning but also highly caustic to human skin. Washing involved soaking the textiles in cold stream water, applying the lye soap, and then beating and scrubbing the fabric against rocks or wooden boards to work the soap through and dislodge dirt. This required sustained physical effort. Wool especially was heavy when wet, and working it thoroughly meant repeatedly lifting, wringing, beating and scrubbing. The entire process might take several hours for a single load of laundry, and a household's accumulated dirty textiles could easily represent a full day of work. The effect of this work on the frilla's hands was severe and cumulative. Lye is a strong base that breaks down fats and proteins, which is why it cleans effectively, but also why it destroys human skin. Repeated exposure to lye caused chemical burns that manifested as redness, pain, cracking, and eventually chronic dermatitis. In cold water, which was the only option for most of the year, the hands would become numb, making it difficult to feel injuries as they happened. The combination of cold water and caustic soap was devastating to skin integrity. Archaeological evidence supports this picture of damaged hands. Skeletal remains of women from low-status burials sometimes show evidence of chronic infection in the finger bones, suggesting that repeated skin breakdown led to infections that penetrated deep into tissue. Some skeletons show evidence of partially healed or poorly healed fractures in the hands, perhaps from accidents while beating laundry on rocks while hands were too numb to register the impact properly. The sagas occasionally mention servants or thralls with damaged hands, described matter-of-factly. One saga describes a slave woman as having hands ruined from work, and notes that she was sold for a reduced price because of this damage. Another mentions a frilla whose hands were red and cracked as part of a physical description. These weren't considered remarkable or worthy of sympathy. They were simply the normal result of performing laundry work for years. Winter laundry was especially hazardous. Streams and lakes would partially freeze, requiring the frilla to break through ice to access water. Working with wet textiles and lye soap in freezing temperatures meant that her hands and forearms would become soaked and then exposed to cold. This was a recipe for frostbite, the freezing of tissue that could lead to permanent damage or loss of fingers. Even mild, repeated frostbite could cause chronic problems, decreased circulation, increased sensitivity to cold, permanent pain, and numbness. The physical position required for laundry work also took its toll. Hours spent kneeling or crouching on stream banks, bent over work, caused the same knee and back problems we've seen with other tasks. The repetitive motion of beating and scrubbing fabric created shoulder and elbow stress, and the constant exposure to cold water, not just hands but often arms up to the elbows, plus splashing on the rest of the body, caused chronic chilling that made the frilla vulnerable to respiratory infections and other cold-related illnesses. One particularly detailed archaeological study from the site of Trelleborg in Denmark examined skeletal remains from an area identified as servants' quarters. Among several female skeletons, researchers found consistent patterns, evidence of chronic malnutrition, severe degenerative joint disease, particularly in knees and hands, and signs of repeated infection. Chemical analysis of the finger bones from one skeleton showed evidence of repeated chemical burns, suggesting chronic exposure to caustic substances. The researchers concluded this woman had likely spent years performing tasks involving harsh chemicals, almost certainly laundry work with lye soap. The psychological dimension of this work shouldn't be ignored either. Laundry was cold, wet, physically demanding, and destroyed your hands, but it also represented a particular kind of dehumanization. The frilla washed the master's clothes, the mistress's clothes, the clothing of the legitimate children. She maintained their comfort and cleanliness, while her own appearance was of no concern to anyone. She might have only rags to wear, herself might go months without adequate washing of her own personal garments. but she was expected to maintain the household's textiles carefully. And there was no escape from this work. Dirty clothes accumulated inevitably. Someone had to wash them. That someone was always the lowest status woman available. If she was too ill to work, the work would accumulate until she recovered, or she would be forced to work anyway, extending her illness and risking more serious complications. If her hands were too damaged to hold the fabric properly, she would be considered useless, worthless, and likely disposed of. The excavation of a small farm site in Norway revealed something poignant in this regard. Near the washing area at the stream, researchers found buried a collection of small objects including a spindle whorl, some broken weaving tools, and a few bone fragments. Analysis suggested these were belongings of a low-status woman, perhaps buried after her death or disposed of when she could no longer work. The location, at the washing area rather than in a proper cemetery, suggests her life ended while still performing the same labour that had defined her existence. Her burial, if we can call it that, was as utilitarian and unremarkable as her life had been. So the next time you sort your laundry into a washing machine, add detergent designed to be gentle on hands, and return later to move clean clothes to the dryer. Consider what laundry meant in the Viking Age. Consider kneeling on frozen ground beside an icy stream, breaking through ice, plunging your hands into caustic lye soap and freezing water, beating heavy wet wool against rocks for hours, your hands cracking and bleeding, your knees aching, your back screaming, doing this day after day until your hands were so damaged that you couldn't work anymore, and were therefore worthless, disposable, already forgotten. Chapter 11. The Children You Bear But Don't Own. Of all the aspects of a frilla's existence that reveal the depth of her powerlessness, perhaps none is more psychologically devastating than her relationship with her own children. She carried them in her body for 9 months, endured the pain and danger of childbirth, nursed them at her breast, and yet in the eyes of Norse law, she had no legal connection to them whatsoever. They belonged entirely to their father, and she had no say in their upbringing, their fate, or even whether she would be allowed to remain near them. The biological reality of motherhood existed independently of legal structures, of course. A frilla who bore a child would have the same hormonal responses, the same instinctive protective feelings, the same emotional bonds that any mother experiences. She would feel the child move in her womb, would labour to bring it into the world, would hold the infant and feel that profound connection. But unlike a free woman whose children were legally connected to her family line, and whose maternal rights had some protection in law, the frilla's motherhood existed in a legal void. The child, if acknowledged by the father, was considered his legitimate offspring. This sounds positive. Surely being acknowledged as legitimate was better than being rejected. But the implications were complex. The child had inheritance rights, though typically reduced compared to children of the legal wife. The child could be raised in the household and might even achieve significant status. But none of this created any legal bond between mother and child. The father could, at any time, for any reason, separate them permanently. This happened with disturbing frequency. The sagas record numerous instances of masters separating frilla from their children. Sometimes the child was sent to foster parents, a common Norse practice where children were raised by other families to create political and social bonds. Sometimes the frilla was sold away while the child remained in the household. Sometimes the child was sold and the frilla kept. The decision rested entirely with the father, and the mother's wishes were legally and practically irrelevant. The Laxdæla saga preserves one such incident in some detail. A man named Hoskuld had a frilla named Melkorka, who bore him a son. The boy, named Olaf, was raised in the household and became a prominent figure in Icelandic society. But Melkorka herself, despite being the mother of this important man, remained unfree throughout much of the saga's narrative, her status dependent on her master's will rather than on her relationship to her son. When she eventually gained freedom, it came through her son's advocacy, not through any maternal right. Even more distressing is the saga's casual mention of other cases where frilla and children were separated permanently. The Eyrbyggja saga notes that a man sold his frilla but kept her 2 sons who were useful workers. The woman disappears from the narrative entirely, her fate unrecorded, her separation from her children mentioned only because it explained the presence of the 2 boys in the household. Her experience of this separation, the trauma of having her children taken from her, was considered too unremarkable to warrant description. Archaeological evidence can't directly tell us about specific instances of mother-child separation, but it does reveal the broader context of unfree women's reproductive lives. Skeletal remains of women from low-status burials frequently show evidence of multiple pregnancies, scarring on the pelvis, bone chemistry changes that correlate with pregnancy timing, and sometimes evidence of obstetric trauma from difficult births. Some skeletons show evidence of 4, 5, 6 or more pregnancies, suggesting these women spent much of their adult lives pregnant or nursing. But here's the disturbing detail. Very few children's remains are found in association with these women's burials. Free women of status were sometimes buried with infants who had died, particularly if both mother and child died in childbirth, a common enough occurrence that it appears regularly in the archaeological record. But thrall women's burials almost never include children, even though the skeletal evidence tells us they bore many children. This suggests that even in death the separation between unfree mother and child was maintained. The children, if they died young, were buried elsewhere, with their father's family line perhaps, or simply disposed of in unmarked locations. The psychological reality of this situation is almost impossible for a modern person to fully comprehend. Imagine carrying a child for 9 months, feeling it grow inside you, experiencing all the physical and emotional changes of pregnancy. Imagine going through labour in the Viking Age without pain relief, without medical support, with a significant chance of death, and bringing a child into the world through your own body's supreme effort. Imagine holding that infant, nursing it, caring for it through the vulnerable early months. And then imagine knowing, every single day, that this child is not yours, that they can be taken from you at any moment, that you have no say in their upbringing, no right to protect them, no legal connection that anyone is bound to respect, that if the master decides to send the child away, or sell you away from the child, you have no recourse, no appeal, no ability to prevent it. Your maternal feelings are biologically real but legally meaningless. This created an impossible emotional situation. Some frilla probably tried to protect themselves by remaining emotionally distant from their children, knowing that attachment would only make the inevitable separation more painful. But biological and psychological realities make this extremely difficult. The hormones of pregnancy and nursing, the infant's dependence, the mother's evolved caregiving instincts all work against emotional detachment. Most frilla probably loved their children desperately while simultaneously living in constant fear of separation. The presence of other children in the household, the legitimate children of the master and his legal wife, would have made this situation even more painful. The frilla would see these children treated with affection and care, their futures secured by inheritance and family connections. Meanwhile, her own children, though acknowledged by the father, occupied an ambiguous position. They were better off than completely unacknowledged children of thralls, certainly, but they were not full members of the family, and their mother's low status could limit their opportunities. And there was another dimension to this that the sources only hint at, but that must have been psychologically complex: the legitimate wife's attitude toward these children. They were her husband's offspring, reminders of his sexual relationship with another woman. Some wives might have directed cruelty toward these children as a way of punishing the frilla or expressing resentment toward the husband. The frilla would have to watch this, unable to protect her children from mistreatment, unable to advocate for them without risking punishment herself. One passage from the Njal saga, though it doesn't explicitly involve a frilla, illustrates the vulnerability of children born to complicated household situations. a woman described as being of low birth, has a son who is repeatedly humiliated and abused by higher status household members. His mother's inability to protect him is mentioned as contributing to his eventual psychological problems and violent behaviour. While this specific case involved free people of different status levels, it illustrates how household hierarchy could create situations where mothers were powerless to protect their children, and how this powerlessness could have lasting psychological effects. For the frilla, this powerlessness was absolute. She brought children into the world through her own body's labour, but they were never truly hers. They were property of the household, resources to be allocated as the master saw fit, and she could only watch as their lives unfolded, hoping desperately that she would be allowed to remain near them, knowing that this hope rested entirely on someone else's whim. It was perhaps the cruelest aspect of an existence defined by cruelty. Even the most fundamental human bond between mother and child was subject to the absolute power of ownership. Chapter 12. Animal Tending in All Weather. Beyond the domestic work performed inside the longhouse, the frilla had extensive responsibilities for animal care. Norse farms depended on livestock: cattle for milk and meat, sheep for wool and meat, goats for milk, pigs for meat, chickens for eggs, and horses for transportation and prestige. These animals required daily tending in all weather, year-round, and this labour fell largely to the lower status household members. The daily routine of animal care began early, often before the household's human members had eaten breakfast. Animals needed to be fed, which in winter meant hauling stored hay from the outbuildings where it was kept. A dairy cow might consume 20 to 30 pounds of hay per day in winter when no fresh grazing was available. For a household with several cattle, multiple sheep and other livestock, this represented significant daily labour just moving feed from storage to animals. Milking was a daily necessity for any household that kept dairy animals. Cows needed milking twice a day. Goats might be milked once or twice depending on their milk production. This was skilled work requiring some practice. Milk a cow incorrectly and you might get kicked, or the cow might hold back milk, or the teats could become damaged leading to infection. But it was also work that had to be done regardless of weather, regardless of the frilla's physical condition, regardless of other demands on her time. Picture a winter morning in Norway. It's still dark, temperature well below freezing, and the frilla must leave the relative warmth of the longhouse to enter the livestock shelter. This would be a separate building, unheated except for the animal's body warmth, dark, and filled with the smell of animal waste and wet fur. She would need to bring a lamp or work by feel, finding the cow in the darkness, settling onto a low stool beside it, and coaxing milk into a wooden bucket. Her hands would be freezing. This work couldn't be done wearing mittens or thick gloves. You needed finger dexterity to milk properly. The cow's udder provided some warmth, but the work still required keeping hands functional in temperatures that made this difficult. Chilblains and mild frostbite would be constant problems for anyone doing this work regularly. And if the cow was temperamental, uncooperative, or simply uncomfortable, the process could take much longer and might result in being kicked or knocked over. Beyond feeding and milking, livestock required mucking out, removing accumulated manure and soiled bedding. This was heavy, disgusting work that had to be done regularly to prevent disease and keep animals healthy. The frilla would shovel or fork out sodden, heavy manure, haul it away to the midden heap and bring in fresh bedding material when available. In winter, manure might be partially frozen to the floor, requiring extra effort to break up and remove. The physical danger of working with large animals cannot be overstated. Cattle are powerful and can be unpredictable. A cow weighs perhaps 800 to 1,000 pounds and can kick with tremendous force. Being kicked by a cow can break bones, rupture organs, or kill outright if the blow lands on the head. Horses are even larger and more powerful. Even sheep, though smaller, can knock over a person and cause injury in confined spaces. Archaeological evidence shows that people working closely with animals in the Viking Age suffered frequent injuries. Skeletal remains show healed fractures consistent with being kicked or trampled. Broken ribs, fractured arms or legs, sometimes skull fractures. One skeleton from a farm site in Iceland showed evidence of a severe leg fracture that had healed badly, leaving the leg shorter than the other and causing a permanent limp. The location and nature of the break suggested being kicked or trampled by a large animal. The sagas occasionally mention these dangers in passing. One saga notes that a thrall was killed by a bull, with no more detail than that. His death was unremarkable enough not to warrant elaboration. Another mentions a servant woman who was injured by a horse and could not work for some time, which apparently was notable only because it disrupted household labour distribution. These brief mentions suggest that animal-related injuries and deaths were common enough to be mentioned casually when relevant to the plot, but not worth detailed description. For the frilla, the constant danger of working with animals must have been psychologically exhausting as well as physically hazardous. Every time she entered a livestock shelter, there was some risk. A usually docile animal might be frightened or in pain and respond aggressively. A crowded space might mean being trapped between large animals with no easy escape. And if she was injured, medical care would be minimal to non-existent. She would be expected to heal on her own and return to work as soon as possible. There was also the reality of animal diseases and parasites. Livestock in close quarters with minimal veterinary care carried various parasitic infections, lice, mites, worms. Some of these could transfer to humans. The frilla working in close contact with animals, handling manure and soiled bedding, would be constantly exposed to these parasites. Skeletal evidence sometimes shows indicators of chronic parasitic infection, and analysis of soil samples from Viking Age sites confirms the presence of various livestock parasites that could affect humans. Seasonal variations added different challenges to animal work. In spring, animals needed to be moved to grazing areas, requiring oversight to ensure they didn't stray or fall victim to predators. Lambing and calving meant additional work attending births, some of which required intervention to save the mother or offspring. Summer brought biting insects that tormented both animals and the people tending them. Fall required slaughtering animals that wouldn't be kept through winter. Bloody, heavy work that created meat that needed immediate processing and preservation. But winter remained the most challenging season for animal care. The long hours of darkness meant much of the work had to be done in the dark or by inadequate lamplight. The cold made every task more difficult and dangerous. Feed supplies had to be carefully managed to last through the winter, and if they ran short, animals weakened or died, which represented both economic loss and potentially punishment for the thrall responsible for their care. One excavation in Sweden revealed what might be the remains of a livestock shelter that had partially collapsed during winter. Among the debris were found both animal bones and what appeared to be a human skeleton, with injuries consistent with being trapped in a structural collapse. Whether this person was attempting to feed animals during bad weather when the building failed, or was trapped inside for some other reason, we cannot know. But it illustrates the dangers inherent in working with and around large animals in crude structures during harsh conditions. The frilla's relationship with the animals she tended must have been psychologically complex. These were not pets, they were economic resources, and their care was forced labour, not a choice. Yet she probably spent more time with them than with any humans who treated her kindly, and animals, unlike the household's people, didn't care about status or freedom. A cow doesn't distinguish between free and unfree milkers. This might have provided some small psychological comfort, or it might simply have been another form of isolation. Chapter 13. The perpetual exhaustion. We've walked through many of the specific tasks that filled a frilla's day. Water hauling, grinding, cooking, textile work, laundry, animal tending. Each of these required hours of sustained physical labour. But to truly understand her existence, we need to consider what all this added up to. A state of perpetual, crushing exhaustion that became her baseline reality and likely contributed directly to her early death. A typical day for a frilla might begin at 4 or 5 in the morning, particularly in winter when work had to begin well before dawn. From that moment until 9 or 10 at night, she would be working almost continuously. Brief pauses to eat, always after others had eaten, provided minimal rest. There were no coffee breaks, no lunch hours, no moments of genuine relaxation where she controlled her own time and body. Every moment was either active labour or the brief, inadequate rest of someone too exhausted to continue temporarily. Let's estimate conservatively. If the frilla woke at 5 a.m. and worked until 10 p.m, that's 17 hours of labour. Not office work, where you might spend time in meetings or reading documents, but physical labour, lifting, carrying, walking, kneeling, standing, bending, scrubbing, hauling, hour after hour after hour. And this wasn't an unusually hard day. This was every day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, for her entire life, from whatever age she was put to work until her body gave out. The human body isn't designed for this. Even healthy, well-nourished people performing sustained physical labour need adequate rest to recover. Muscles need time to repair microdamage from use. The cardiovascular system needs periods of rest. Sleep is essential for cognitive function, immune system health, and tissue repair. The frilla got none of this in adequate measure. Sleep deprivation was chronic. Even when she was allowed to stop working at night, she still had to sleep on the cold floor of the longhouse, in conditions that made quality sleep nearly impossible. Cold, smoke, the noise of other household members, the possibility of being summoned by the master for sexual purposes. Modern research tells us that chronic sleep deprivation has cascading effects on health: impaired immune function, increased inflammation, hormonal disruption, cognitive impairment, increased risk of accidents, and shortened lifespan. The frilla experienced all of this with no understanding of what was happening to her body at a physiological level. She would simply feel constantly tired, constantly struggling to maintain focus and energy, constantly vulnerable to illness because her immune system was compromised by overwork and inadequate rest. And this exhaustion wasn't a temporary state to endure until things got better. It was permanent. There was no prospect of vacation, of recovery time, of lighter work periods. The exhaustion accumulated over years until it became lethal. Archaeological evidence supports this picture of chronic exhaustion and overwork. Skeletal analysis of remains from low-status burials consistently shows what bioarchaeologists call markers of physiological stress, indicators that the body was constantly operating under conditions of extreme demand without adequate recovery. Bones show accelerated wear patterns suggesting the skeleton was bearing loads and performing movements that caused damage faster than the body could repair it. One particular indicator is especially telling: the presence of stress lines in long bones and teeth. These are markers laid down when the body experiences periods of extreme physiological stress, severe malnutrition, illness, or overwork. They appear as horizontal lines of altered bone density that can be detected through X-ray analysis. Multiple stress lines indicate multiple periods of severe stress. Skeletons from Viking Age thrall burials frequently show numerous stress lines, suggesting lives punctuated by repeated crises that the body barely survived. The age at death for these women tells a stark story. While wealthy free women of the Viking Age might live into their 50s or even 60s, not by modern standards of longevity but respectable for the time, thrall women frequently died in their 20s and 30s. Some bioarchaeological studies suggest that female thralls had an average lifespan 10 to 15 years shorter than free women of the same period. They weren't dying primarily from specific diseases or injuries, though these contributed, but from simple exhaustion, their bodies wearing out from overwork. The sagas occasionally preserve references to this reality, though usually in passing. One saga mentions that a man's thrall died of exhaustion in the spring work, with no more detail than that. Another notes that a household went through several servants because they didn't last long. These weren't unusual situations worth detailed description. They were the ordinary background of Norse life, where unfree people were worked until they died and then replaced. Modern studies of extreme labour conditions provide context for understanding what this level of sustained overwork does to human beings. Research on forced labour situations, on populations experiencing famine while being required to work, on prisoners in labour camps, consistently shows that human bodies begin breaking down under sustained overwork combined with inadequate rest and nutrition. The immune system fails, the heart becomes stressed, muscles waste despite constant use because the body is cannibalizing itself for energy. Eventually systems fail completely. The psychological dimension of perpetual exhaustion also deserves consideration. Chronic fatigue affects cognitive function, emotional regulation, and psychological well-being. The frilla would have experienced impaired judgment, difficulty concentrating, emotional numbness or volatility, and a general sense of hopelessness and despair that came not from understanding her situation abstractly, but from the concrete, overwhelming experience of never having energy, never feeling rested, always being one step away from collapse. And there was no escape. She couldn't quit. She couldn't take a day off. She couldn't rest when sick. Illness just meant working while ill, which prolonged the illness and made recovery less likely. If she collapsed from exhaustion, she might receive a brief respite until she could work again, or she might be punished for laziness, or she might simply be left to recover or die on her own. Her value to the household was her labour, and if she couldn't provide that labour, she had no value at all. One detail from the excavation at Birka illustrates this brutally. Among the skeletal remains of several female thralls buried in the service areas of the settlement, researchers found one woman who appeared to have died during pregnancy, probably in her mid-20s. Skeletal analysis showed she was severely malnourished despite being pregnant, had evidence of chronic exhaustion in her bone chemistry, and had likely been performing heavy labour until very near the time of death. She was buried without ceremony in a shallow grave near where she had worked. The message is clear. She worked until she literally couldn't anymore, and then she was disposed of and replaced. So when we imagine a frilla's daily life, we shouldn't picture individual tasks in isolation. We should picture a woman so tired that every movement requires conscious effort, so depleted that her body is slowly consuming itself, so exhausted that her mind struggles to process information, or feel emotions beyond the overwhelming need for rest that never comes. This was her reality, every day, until exhaustion finally killed her. Chapter 14. Food, last and least. Earlier, we discussed the frilla's role in preparing food for the household, working over smoky fires and managing heavy cauldrons. Now we need to examine the other side of this equation, her position in the household eating hierarchy, and the chronic malnutrition that resulted from being last and least at every meal. In Norse culture, as in most traditional societies, the order in which people ate and the portions they received reflected social hierarchy with brutal clarity. Meals were not egalitarian family gatherings where everyone sat together and shared equally. Instead, they were structured events that reinforced status distinctions at every moment. And the frilla at the bottom of this hierarchy experienced this subordination multiple times every day. The master ate first and best. He received the choicest cuts of meat, the finest bread, adequate portions of everything. The legal wife ate with or immediately after him, also receiving quality food in sufficient quantity. The legitimate children ate next, their portions ensuring adequate nutrition for growth and health. Male thralls, if the household had them, might eat before or after female thralls depending on their value and the household's specific customs. And finally, the frilla ate whatever remained, which might be scraps, might be burnt or inferior portions, might be barely enough to sustain life. This wasn't occasional or exceptional. This was every meal, every day for the frilla's entire life. She prepared food while hungry. She served others while her own stomach cramped with need. She cleaned up after the household's meal before finally eating the remnants. The psychological cruelty of this is significant, but the physical consequences were even more severe. Chronic malnutrition doesn't mean starvation necessarily. It means consistently receiving inadequate nutrition, not enough calories to support the energy expenditure required by constant labour, not enough protein for muscle maintenance and repair, not enough vitamins and minerals for basic physiological functions. Over time, this creates a cascade of health problems that shortened lifespan and made every aspect of existence more difficult. The archaeological evidence for this is extensive and unambiguous. Chemical analysis of bones from Viking Age burials can reveal dietary patterns through the ratios of certain isotopes that accumulate in bone tissue. These isotopes reflect the types of food consumed and, to some degree, the quantity and quality of diet. When researchers analyse bones from high-status burials versus low-status burials, the differences are stark. High-status individuals show isotope ratios consistent with regular consumption of meat, dairy products, and a varied diet. Low-status individuals, particularly women from thrall burials, show ratios consistent with a heavily grain-based diet with minimal meat or dairy, despite often living in households that raised livestock and had access to these foods. They were cooking meat and dairy for others while subsisting primarily on porridge and inferior bread. Skeletal analysis reveals other markers of chronic malnutrition. Bone density is reduced in individuals who didn't receive adequate nutrition, particularly calcium and vitamin D. This creates bones that are more fragile, more prone to fracture, and that heal poorly when broken. Teeth show characteristic patterns of enamel defects that form during childhood malnutrition. Horizontal lines or pits in the enamel that mark periods when the developing tooth didn't receive adequate nutrition for proper formation. Height is another indicator. Humans have a genetic height potential, but actually achieving that potential requires adequate nutrition during growth years. Skeletal remains from thrall burials consistently show that these individuals were significantly shorter than free people of the same period, often 4 to 6 inches shorter on average. This wasn't genetic difference, it was stunted, growth from childhood malnutrition continuing through adolescence. One particularly comprehensive study examined remains from several Norwegian farm sites and found that women buried in low-status locations averaged about 152 centimetres, just under 5 feet tall, while free women averaged about 163 centimetres, about 5 feet 4 inches. This 11 centimetre difference represents years of inadequate nutrition during growth, marking these women permanently with the physical evidence of their low status. The functional consequences of chronic malnutrition extended beyond height. Malnourished individuals have compromised immune systems, making them vulnerable to every infection and illness that circulates through the household. They heal more slowly from injuries. Pregnancy and childbirth place enormous nutritional demands on the body, and malnourished women faced higher rates of complications, stillbirth, and maternal mortality. The labour demands placed on the frilla's body required substantial energy and protein, which her diet didn't adequately provide, forcing her body to cannibalise its own muscle and fat stores to keep functioning. There's something particularly cruel about making someone prepare food they will barely share in. The frilla spent hours grinding grain, cooking meals, managing the household's food stores, preserving meat and dairy, baking bread, all while chronically hungry. She was surrounded by food but effectively excluded from adequate access to it. The smells of cooking meat, the sight of the household eating well, the knowledge that she was creating abundance for others while her own body slowly starved, this must have been psychologically devastating. The sagas occasionally reference this dynamic, usually in ways that reveal how normal it was considered. One saga mentions that a thrall complained about inadequate food and was beaten for the presumption of complaining. The Grégas law code specifies minimum food rations that must be provided to thralls, but these rations were explicitly less than what free household members received, and enforcement was essentially non-existent since thralls couldn't bring legal complaints. Some historical sources suggest that particularly cruel masters or mistresses would explicitly use food deprivation as punishment, reducing already inadequate portions for various offences or perceived failures. But even normal feeding practices, where the thrall received whatever was left after everyone else ate, created systematic malnutrition. There was no need for deliberate starvation. The ordinary operation of household hierarchy achieved the same result gradually. We should also consider the seasonal dimension of this food scarcity. In summer and fall, when food was relatively plentiful from harvest and slaughter, even the scraps might provide adequate nutrition. But in late winter and early spring, the hungry months before new crops came in, food was scarce for everyone, and the portions allocated to the lower status household members would be reduced to bare subsistence or below. This created a pattern of seasonal malnutrition that shows up in skeletal remains as periodic stress lines, corresponding to late winter hardship year after year. One skeleton from a farm in Iceland is particularly illustrative. A woman who died in her late 20s showed 10 clear stress lines in her leg bones, corresponding to 10 periods of severe nutritional stress at roughly annual intervals. She had survived each of these crises, but each left its mark on her skeleton. Finally, one winter, she didn't survive. Whether she died of disease made worse by malnutrition or simply from starvation, the evidence can't tell us. But it can tell us that she spent her entire adult life cycling through periods of severe hunger, never fully recovering before the next crisis hit. So when we picture the frilla's daily life, we should add chronic hunger to the exhaustion, the pain, the vulnerability. She was always somewhat hungry, even after eating. Her body was always operating at deficit, trying to perform brutal physical labour without adequate fuel. And she did all of this while preparing abundance for others, a constant reminder that her exclusion from adequate food was not about scarcity, but about her worthless status in a system that valued her labour, but not her life. Chapter 15. Winter. The darkest months. Throughout our examination of the frilla's daily existence, winter has appeared repeatedly as a factor that made every hardship worse. Now we need to consider winter itself as a distinct element of suffering. The months from roughly November through February, when the northern Scandinavian environment became actively hostile to human survival, and when life in the confined, dark longhouse tested the limits of endurance. The darkness was profound in ways that people living in modern temperate climates struggle to comprehend. In northern Norway, above the Arctic Circle, the sun might not rise at all for several weeks during midwinter. Even in southern Norway and Sweden, midwinter days brought only 4 to 6 hours of weak, grey light, and the longhouse, with its windowless walls and smoke hole, admitted little even of this limited daylight. For practical purposes, the frilla lived in darkness for 18 to 20 hours per day during the darkest months. This darkness wasn't just an inconvenience. It had profound psychological and physiological effects. Modern medical research has identified seasonal affective disorder as a condition linked to reduced sunlight exposure, causing depression, fatigue, and cognitive difficulties. The frilla experienced the most severe form of this, compounded by every other hardship of her existence. The darkness pressed down like a weight, making every task harder, every emotion more difficult to process, every day an exercise in endurance. Work continued in the darkness, of course. Animals still needed tending, at 4 in the morning when it was pitch black. Water still needed hauling. Food still needed preparing. But all of this work became more difficult and more dangerous in the dark. Navigating icy paths to the stream while carrying heavy buckets risked falls and injury. Working near open fires in darkness increased the chance of burns or of starting a catastrophic house fire. even simple tasks like finding tools or sorting materials became frustratingly difficult without adequate light. The cold compounded every hardship. Temperatures in Scandinavia regularly dropped well below freezing during winter. The longhouse provided some protection through shared body heat and the central fire, but it was never truly warm, especially at the ends away from the hearth where the frilla typically slept and worked. Condensation would freeze on the interior walls. Breath made visible clouds in the air. Water left in buckets might freeze solid overnight. For the frilla, who typically had the least adequate clothing and who spent time outdoors regardless of weather, the cold was a constant torment. Her hands, frequently wet from work, developed chilblains, painful inflammation of fingers and toes from repeated exposure to cold. Frostbite was a real risk during tasks like breaking ice to reach water or tending animals in the unheated livestock shelter. The cold sapped energy and made every movement more difficult as muscles stiffened and extremities numbed. The confinement of winter created its own psychological pressures. During summer, work took the frilla outdoors frequently, providing variation in environment and some escape from the household's tensions. But winter work was largely confined to the longhouse, or required brief, miserable trips to nearby outbuildings. The frilla spent months in the same smoky, dark, crowded space with the same people who held power over her and who might be growing increasingly irritable from their own winter confinement. Historical sources hint at what they called winter madness, psychological breakdowns associated with the long dark months. The Icelandic sagas mention people becoming violent, erratic or suicidal during winter, though they typically attribute this to supernatural causes, rather than recognising it as a response to extreme environmental stress and confinement. For someone already living in conditions of profound powerlessness and suffering, the added stress of winter darkness and confinement could push beyond the limits of psychological endurance. The risk of death increased during winter across all social classes, but particularly for the vulnerable. Food stores had to last from fall harvest through spring planting, a gap of 6 months or more. If the harvest had been poor, or if the household had miscalculated needs, or if stores were depleted by unforeseen events, late winter brought real hunger. The frilla, eating last and least, would feel this hunger most acutely. Combined with the energy demands of staying warm and continuing heavy labour, winter malnutrition could be lethal. Disease also struck more frequently during winter confinement. Respiratory infections spread easily in the closed environment of the longhouse, passing from person to person with no escape. The frilla, already compromised by exhaustion and malnutrition, was particularly vulnerable. A simple cold could develop into pneumonia. A cough could become chronic bronchitis. And medical care for a sick thrall was minimal. She might be allowed to rest briefly, or she might simply be expected to work through illness. Archaeological evidence shows elevated mortality during late winter and early spring. Analysis of skeletal remains from Viking Age cemeteries shows that more people died during these months than during summer or early fall. This isn't surprising. Winter was the season of scarcity and hardship, but the differential impact by social class is notable. Low-status individuals died disproportionately during the hungry months, suggesting they bore the brunt of food scarcity and were the first to succumb when resources ran low. One excavation in Sweden revealed something poignant: a shallow grave near a farmstead containing the remains of a young woman who appeared to have died during late winter. The burial was hasty, minimal. The ground was probably still partially frozen, making digging difficult. There were no grave goods. The woman's skeleton showed evidence of recent severe weight loss, suggesting she had starved to death or died of illness complicated by malnutrition. She was buried immediately and without ceremony, likely because winter made proper burial difficult, but also because her death was considered unremarkable enough not to warrant extraordinary effort. The sagas preserve scattered references to winter deaths. One mentions that several thralls didn't survive the winter in a household that experienced food shortages. Another notes that a particular winter was so severe that many slaves and poor people died. These deaths aren't described in detail or mourned in the narratives. They're mentioned only as background context, evidence of how hard that particular winter was. The individuals who died are unnamed, their suffering unrecorded, their deaths considered predictable casualties of the season. For the frilla who survived each winter, spring must have brought profound relief. Longer days, warmer weather, the prospect of fresh food as plants began growing and animals gave birth. But it also brought the knowledge that another winter would come, that the cycle would repeat, that she would have to endure it all again. Each winter survived brought her closer to the final winter she wouldn't survive, and there was never any prospect of escape from this cycle of seasonal suffering. Chapter 16. The Medical Void. When we discuss the various hardships that defined a frilla's existence, the exhausting labour, the inadequate food, the exposure to cold and danger, we must also confront a reality that amplified every other suffering: the complete absence of meaningful medical care. Injuries went untreated. Illnesses ran their course without intervention. Chronic conditions worsened progressively until they became disabling or fatal. For the frilla, sickness or injury didn't bring rest and recuperation. It brought continued work expectations and the threat of being discarded as useless. Viking Age medicine was limited even for wealthy free people. There were no antibiotics, no surgical techniques beyond basic wound treatment, no understanding of germ theory or infection control. Folk remedies existed. Herbal preparations, poultices, prayers and charms, but their effectiveness was minimal at best. For serious illness or injury, survival depended largely on the body's own resources and on luck. But even this limited medical attention was distributed according to social hierarchy, and thralls received little or none. Consider a common scenario. The frilla cuts her hand badly while working with a knife. For a free person of the household, this might prompt cleaning the wound, bandaging, perhaps applying some herbal preparation believed to promote healing, and several days of lighter work to allow recovery. For the frilla, the wound might be rinsed briefly with water, but she would be expected to continue working immediately. The cut would be exposed to dirt, smoke, animal waste, all the contaminants of daily labour. Infection would be likely, possibly inevitable. Without treatment, a simple cut could develop into a serious infection. The wound would become inflamed, painful, potentially developing into an abscess. The infection might spread up the arm, creating red streaks of sepsis visible beneath the skin. Fever would develop. Without antibiotics, the body had to fight the infection on its own, and in someone already compromised by exhaustion and malnutrition, this fight was far from certain. Many infections that would be trivial in the modern world were potentially lethal in the Viking Age. Archaeological evidence shows that infections were common and often deadly among low-status individuals. Skeletal remains frequently show signs of chronic or severe infection. Bone changes that occur when infection persists for weeks or months, or acute changes suggesting a sudden overwhelming infection that killed quickly. Some skeletons show evidence of osteomyelitis, a bone infection that causes severe pain and can be fatal. Others show healed or partially healed fractures with signs of infection in the surrounding bone. Broken bones presented another category of medical crisis that the frilla had to endure without adequate care. A fractured arm or leg requires immobilization to heal properly. The bone ends must be aligned and kept stable, while new bone tissue forms. For a free person, this might mean splinting and weeks of reduced activity. For a thrall, it might mean nothing at all beyond perhaps a rough, splint, and continued work expectations because the household couldn't afford to lose her labour. Many skeletal remains from low-status burials show poorly healed fractures, bones that knit together but not in proper alignment, creating permanent deformity and reduced function. Some show evidence of fractures that never fully healed, with false joints forming where the bone ends moved against each other without proper fusion. These injuries would have been chronically painful and limiting, yet the women who bore them apparently continued working because they had no choice. Childbirth represented perhaps the most dangerous medical crisis that frilla faced repeatedly. Without modern obstetric care, maternal mortality was high across all social classes. Estimates suggest that 5 to 10% of births resulted in the mother's death. But for thrall women, the risk was even higher due to malnutrition, lack of assistance, and the expectation of rapid return to work regardless of complications. Obstructed labour, when the baby cannot pass through the birth canal, was often fatal for both mother and child in the pre-modern world. Without surgical intervention, caesarean sections were not survivable in the Viking Age. A woman in obstructed labour might suffer for days before dying of exhaustion, hemorrhage, or infection. Even if she survived, she might suffer devastating injuries like obstetric fistula, which we discussed earlier, or uterine prolapse, or severe tearing that never healed properly. Skeletal evidence shows the brutal reality of childbirth for Viking Age women. Pelvic bones sometimes show fractures or stress injuries from difficult births. Some female skeletons are found with fetal bones still in the pelvic cavity, indicating death during childbirth, with both mother and child buried together. But these are typically free women whose deaths were considered significant enough to warrant careful burial. Thrall women who died in childbirth were probably disposed of with minimal ceremony, leaving less clear archaeological traces. The sagas mention childbirth deaths among thralls with disturbing casualness. One saga notes that a man's frilla died birthing, and he soon got another. Another mentions that a woman died of childbed fever, likely an infection following birth, with the same matter-of-fact tone. These weren't tragedies worth elaborating on. They were unremarkable events, the normal hazards of keeping female thralls. Chronic conditions that developed from years of hard labour also went untreated. The arthritis that developed in knees from years of kneeling, the spinal degeneration from carrying heavy loads, the respiratory damage from smoke exposure. All of these worsened progressively without intervention. Pain management consisted of nothing beyond perhaps occasionally being allowed to rest briefly. The frilla worked in constant pain, with conditions that would be considered disabling in the modern world, because disability meant uselessness, and uselessness meant disposal. Dental problems deserve mention as well. Without dentistry, tooth decay and dental abscesses were common and agonising. A dental abscess, an infection at the root of a tooth, causes severe pain that can make eating and sleeping nearly impossible. The infection can spread to the jawbone and beyond, potentially becoming fatal. Skeletal remains from Viking Age sites frequently show dental disease, abscesses, and tooth loss. Some skulls show evidence of infections that spread from teeth into the facial bones or sinuses. For the frilla suffering from a dental abscess, there was no treatment. She would endure the pain while continuing to work, to grind grain with her aching jaw, to eat inadequate food despite the agony of chewing. Eventually the tooth might die and the abscess drain, providing some relief, or the infection might spread and kill her. Either way, she received no care, no sympathy, no reduction in work expectations. The psychological impact of living without access to medical care adds another dimension to the frilla's suffering. Imagine knowing that any injury or illness could become life-threatening, that you have no recourse to treatment, that your body's ability to heal itself is your only protection. Every ache could be the beginning of something serious. Every fever could be fatal. Every pregnancy could be your last. This knowledge would create constant background anxiety, a perpetual awareness of vulnerability. One skeleton from a Norwegian farm site illustrates this medical abandonment with particular clarity. The remains were of a woman in her early 30s who had suffered multiple serious injuries and illnesses during her life. Her left arm showed a badly healed fracture that had left it shortened and weakened. Her spine showed severe degeneration suggesting years of heavy labour. Her teeth showed multiple abscesses and severe decay. And finally, Her leg bone showed evidence of a fracture that had become infected, leading to osteomyelitis that likely killed her. Each injury, each condition, had been survived or endured without adequate care, and finally one infection overwhelmed her body's depleted resources. She was buried without ceremony in a marginal location, her suffering recorded only in her bones. Chapter 17. The Threat of Sale. Beyond all the daily hardships we've explored, the labour, the hunger, the cold, the pain, the frilla lived with another form of insecurity that was uniquely psychological. The knowledge that at any moment she could be sold. She was property, and property could be transferred to new ownership at the owner's whim. This created a perpetual uncertainty that coloured every relationship, every interaction, every moment of relative stability. Nothing was secure because she wasn't a person in the eyes of law. She was a thing that could be disposed of. The slave trade was extensive in the Viking Age world. Major trading centres like Hedeby, Birka, and Dublin had active slave markets where human beings were bought and sold alongside furs, amber, and other commodities. The prices varied based on age, health, skills, and appearance. Young, healthy slaves commanded higher prices, while damaged or elderly ones might sell for very little. This wasn't an occasional or exceptional practice. It was a regular commercial activity embedded in the Norse economy. For the frilla, this meant that her value was constantly being assessed in economic terms. If the household experienced financial difficulties, she might be sold to raise funds. If the master died and the estate was settled, she might be sold as part of dividing the assets. If the legal wife finally insisted on removing her rival from the household, she might be sold to placate the wife. If she became pregnant and the master decided he didn't want another child to support, both she and the unborn child might be sold away. If her productivity declined due to age or injury, she might be sold at reduced price to someone willing to extract whatever remaining labour she could provide. The sagas record numerous instances of thralls being sold, usually mentioned in passing as simple transactions. He sold his thrall woman for 2 marks of silver, appears in one saga, with the same tone as he sold a cow. Another mentions that a man bought a frilla at market, with no more detail than that. She was a purchase, merchandise, interesting only for what she cost and what use she might provide. These brief mentions reveal how normalised this trade in human beings was. Consider what being sold meant in practical terms for the frilla. She would be separated from any relationships she'd formed, other thralls she'd become close to, children she'd borne, even the relative familiarity of the household she'd served. She had no say in the destination, no ability to negotiate terms, no knowledge of what her new situation would be like. She might be sold to a household nearby, or taken hundreds of miles away. Her new master might be relatively decent, or might be cruel. The work demands might be similar or might be worse. She would have no way of knowing until she arrived, and she would arrive as a stranger, the lowest status person in a new household, where everyone else had established relationships and hierarchies. She would need to learn new routines, new expectations, new household dynamics, all while performing the same brutal labour she'd always performed. Any mistakes would bring punishment, but she couldn't avoid mistakes because she was unfamiliar with this particular household's ways. It was a recipe for constant anxiety and frequent suffering. The psychological impact of this constant insecurity cannot be overstated. Imagine living every day knowing that your entire existence could be upended at any moment, that you could be separated from anyone you cared about, sent somewhere unknown, with no control and no information. This would make it difficult to form attachments, difficult to find any sense of stability or security, difficult to maintain hope or purpose. Yet the frilla had to live this way constantly, for her entire life. Archaeological evidence of the slave trade appears in various forms. Excavations at trading centres have uncovered iron shackles and chains used to restrain slaves being transported or held for sale. Some graves in trading towns contain skeletal remains of individuals buried without ceremony in marginal locations, perhaps slaves who died while awaiting sale or during transport. The bones often show evidence of poor health, injuries, and sometimes indicators of violent death, suggesting that the trade was brutal and that death during the process wasn't uncommon. One particularly haunting find from Dublin, a major Viking Age slave trading centre, included the remains of several individuals buried together in a ditch, apparently disposed of as refuse rather than given proper burial. Analysis showed they were of various ages and both sexes, all showing signs of poor nutrition and hard labour, none with any grave goods. The excavators suggested these were likely slaves who had died in the trading centre, perhaps from disease, perhaps from violence, perhaps from despair, and were simply disposed of as worthless merchandise. The sale of frilla along with their children, or worse, the separation of mother and child through sale, appears in historical records with disturbing frequency. The Laxdæla saga mentions a case where a man sold his frilla, but kept her children because they were useful workers. The woman's fate after separation from her children isn't recorded. Her story ends the moment she ceased being relevant to the household's narrative. Her experience of this separation, the trauma of losing her children, apparently wasn't worth mentioning. Some legal codes make provisions regarding the sale of thralls, but these provisions protect the buyer and seller, not the thrall. The Gragas law code specifies that a slave must be sold with disclosure of certain defects, serious illnesses, violent tendencies, theft history, so that the buyer isn't cheated. But there's no provision protecting the thrall's interest or limiting when or how they can be sold. The law treats them as livestock, requiring only that the merchandise be honestly represented. The economic pressures that might lead to a frilla's sale were numerous and unpredictable. A failed harvest might force a household to sell assets. A daughter's marriage might require raising funds for her dowry. A feud might demand compensation payments that depleted the household's wealth. A trading venture might require capital investment. Any of these circumstances could result in the frilla being sold, regardless of how long she'd served the household or what relationships she'd formed there. And there was no appeal, no negotiation, no consideration of her preferences or needs. The master decided to sell. A price was negotiated, and she was transferred to new ownership like any other piece of property. If she resisted, she would be restrained and moved by force. If she protested, she would be beaten into compliance. Her personhood was so thoroughly denied that her own will in the matter was completely irrelevant. One excavation at a farm site in Iceland revealed something suggestive. A small collection of personal items, a worn comb, some beads, a simple knife, buried in a location away from proper graves. The items suggested they had belonged to a woman, but there was no body, no grave marker, no indication of what happened to the person who had owned these things. Perhaps she was sold away, and these were items left behind, too worthless to pack up, but enough that someone noted their presence by burying them. Or perhaps she died and was buried elsewhere, and these were her only possessions. Either way, the archaeological traces suggest a life that left almost no mark. Possessions so minimal they barely registered as worth preserving. Chapter 18. Personal Hygiene, the Impossible Luxury. The Norse people had a reputation, according to some contemporary accounts from England, for being unusually concerned with personal cleanliness and grooming, bathing regularly, combing hair, maintaining appearance. But this reputation, even if partially accurate, applied only to free people with the time, resources, and social standing to prioritise hygiene. For the frilla, personal cleanliness was an unattainable luxury, and the inability to maintain basic hygiene created health problems, social stigma, and psychological distress that compounded her other sufferings. Bathing required access to warm water, soap, time, privacy, and the social permission to prioritise one's own comfort. The frilla had none of these things. Water had to be hauled and heated, a time-consuming process. The household's warm water was used for cooking, for the masters and mistresses bathing, for washing the legitimate children. By the time the frilla might have access to warm water, if she had access at all, it would be cold, filthy, or simply unavailable. She might bathe in cold stream water occasionally during summer, but this provided minimal actual cleaning and was impossible during the frozen winter months. Soap made from lye and fat was valuable and carefully rationed. The harsh lye soap used for laundry was too caustic for regular use on skin. Milder soap for personal bathing existed, but was allocated to free household members first. The frilla might never have access to proper soap for personal use, washing herself with water alone when she washed at all, which did little to remove accumulated grease, sweat, and grime. The frilla's clothing situation compounded hygiene problems. She likely owned only 1 or 2 garments total, a simple dress or tunic, and perhaps a cloak if she was fortunate. These garments had to serve for all purposes: sleeping, working in smoke and dirt, animal, tending, everything. They couldn't be washed frequently because she needed to wear them, and they couldn't be replaced easily because textile production was time-consuming, and the frilla's clothing needs came last. The result was that she wore the same garment for months, accumulating layers of dirt, sweat, grease, and smoke that became embedded in the fabric. The health consequences of this enforced filthiness were severe. Lice were almost certainly universal among people living in these conditions. Body lice live in clothing and feed on human blood, causing intense itching and serving as vectors for diseases like typhus. Head lice infested hair and also caused relentless itching. There was no effective treatment. Careful combing with fine-toothed combs could reduce lice populations, but not eliminate them, and the frilla probably didn't have access to a good comb anyway. She lived in constant itching discomfort, unable to adequately address the parasites tormenting her. Skin infections were inevitable given the combination of poor hygiene, constant exposure to dirt and contaminants, minor injuries from work, and compromised immune function from exhaustion and malnutrition. Boils, abscesses, rashes, fungal infections, all were probably chronic problems for the frilla, painful and disfiguring but not serious enough to warrant any care or respite from work. She scratched at infestations and infections while grinding grain, while cooking, while performing all her tasks. The discomfort a constant background to her already miserable existence. Dental hygiene was similarly impossible to maintain. The Norse diet was hard on teeth. Coarse ground grain containing stone particles from the quern wore down enamel, while the grain starch promoted decay. Without toothbrushes or effective cleaning methods, teeth accumulated plaque and decay. The pain of toothache, as mentioned earlier, could be excruciating, and the chronic dental infection probably contributed to bad breath, adding to the frilla's general uncleanliness and making her presence even more repellent to the free household members. Archaeological evidence confirms this picture of poor hygiene among low-status individuals. Skeletal remains from thrall burials rarely include grooming implements like combs, which appear frequently in higher-status graves. Some skeletons show evidence of severe dental decay and abscesses that would have been visible and offensive in life. Analysis of hair samples, when preserved, has revealed lice eggs. Chemical analysis of clothing fragments, when they survive, shows layers of accumulated body oils, dirt and smoke residue. One well-preserved burial from Denmark included fragments of a woman's clothing that were analysed in detail. The fabric was coarse wool, heavily worn and patched. Chemical analysis showed extensive contamination with smoke, animal waste and human body oils, suggesting the garment had been worn continuously for long periods without adequate washing. There were no grave goods beyond this single worn garment, suggesting this was a low-status individual who owned essentially nothing and maintained no personal hygiene. The social and psychological dimensions of this enforced filthiness deserve consideration. The frilla worked in close proximity to free household members who maintained higher standards of cleanliness. She prepared their food with dirty hands, served them while unwashed, existed in their space while obviously unclean. This physical uncleanliness reinforced her social uncleanliness. Her low status was literally visible and olfactory, marking her as fundamentally different from and inferior to free people. The inability to maintain cleanliness also affected self-perception and dignity. Humans generally desire cleanliness and feel discomfort when forced to remain dirty. The frilla would have been aware of her own filthiness, bothered by the itching, the smell, the greasiness of her hair and skin. But she had no ability to address these problems adequately. This created a constant low-level distress, a feeling of disgust with oneself that couldn't be alleviated, adding psychological suffering to physical discomfort. The sagas occasionally make reference to slaves or servants being dirty, or having markers of low status visible in their appearance. One saga describes a thrall as unwashed and ragged. Another mentions a servant woman as smelling of smoke and sweat. These descriptions aren't sympathetic or analytical. They're simply noting observable facts about people whose cleanliness was of no concern to anyone, including themselves. Modern analysis of living conditions in the Viking Age longhouse suggests that hygiene was generally poor by modern standards, even for free people. Smoke-filled interiors, limited bathing facilities, no sewage systems. But there were gradations even within this generally unsanitary environment, and the frilla occupied the lowest rung. She was dirtier than everyone else, more infested, more odoriferous, more visibly marked by poor hygiene. And this difference, like every other aspect of her existence, was a constant reminder of her worthlessness in the eyes of the society she served. Chapter 19. Language and Cultural Erasure. Many frilla in the Viking Age weren't born into Norse households. They were captured during raids on Ireland, England, Scotland, Francia, or Slavic territories. They arrived in Scandinavia as complete outsiders, speaking different languages, practicing different customs, holding different beliefs, and the Norse system of slavery ensured that within a single generation, their original languages, cultures and identities were effectively erased, leaving no trace beyond occasionally their appearance, or in rare cases their names. Imagine being captured as a young woman, perhaps 15 or 16 years old, from an Irish monastery or a Slavic village. You speak only your native language. Your world has always been your community, your family, your familiar landscape. And suddenly, violently, you're torn away from everything you know. You're chained with other captives, marched to the coast, loaded onto a ship, transported across the sea to a completely foreign land. You arrive unable to communicate, unable to understand commands, unable to express needs or fears. The necessity of learning Norse wasn't a matter of cultural exchange or gradual bilingualism. It was survival. You had to understand orders or face punishment for non-compliance. You had to learn the words for tools, for foods, for household tasks, immediately and under pressure. There was no language instruction, no patience, no consideration for the difficulty. Commands were shouted at you, perhaps accompanied by gestures if you were fortunate, and you had to figure out meaning through context and consequence. Failure to understand resulted in beatings. This forced language acquisition happened while simultaneously trying to learn unfamiliar tasks, adapt to a completely different environment, and cope with the trauma of capture and enslavement. The cognitive load must have been overwhelming, and there was no one to help. If other captured people from your homeland were in the same household, you might communicate with them, but the master would likely discourage this, preferring that thralls learn Norse quickly and abandon their native languages completely. Within months, the frilla would have acquired functional Norse, enough to understand commands and perform tasks. Within a few years, especially if she'd been young at capture, Norse might become her primary language simply through constant use and lack of opportunity to speak her native tongue. If she bore children, those children would be raised speaking only Norse, never learning their mother's original language. Her linguistic heritage would die with her. The cultural erasure extended beyond language. Religious practices were suppressed or simply impossible to maintain. An Irish Christian woman captured and enslaved in pagan Norway had no opportunity to attend Mass, no access to priests or sacraments, no Christian community. She might pray privately, might make the sign of the cross secretly, but her religious identity would be isolated and impossible to practice fully. If she tried to teach Christianity to her children, the master might forbid it, or the children might reject it as irrelevant to their Norse environment. Customs, stories, songs, traditional knowledge, all the cultural content that gives people identity and connection to their heritage, would be lost. The frilla had no audience for her native stories, no occasion to sing traditional songs, no way to practice the customs of her homeland. Even if she remembered, she had no one to share these memories with, no context where they were valued or relevant. Her culture lived only in her memory and died when she died. Archaeological evidence for this cultural erasure appears in subtle ways. Grave goods sometimes reveal foreign origins, Irish-style brooches in Norwegian graves, Slavic-style ornaments in Swedish burials. But these are rare exceptions, cases where the enslaved person somehow maintained or acquired items from their homeland. More commonly, thrall graves contain nothing that would indicate the person's origins. They were buried as anonymous Norse thralls, their foreign origins invisible in the archaeological record unless revealed by isotope analysis of their bones. Modern isotope analysis can reveal where people grew up based on chemical signatures and tooth enamel, which forms during childhood and preserves evidence of local water and food. Some studies of Viking Age burials have found individuals with isotope signatures indicating foreign origins buried in low-status locations without grave goods. These were likely enslaved people from Ireland, Britain, or elsewhere, who lived and died in Scandinavia, leaving almost no trace of their original identities. One such analysis from a Norwegian cemetery identified a woman whose tooth enamel indicated she'd grown up in the British Isles, probably Ireland. She was buried without grave goods in a marginal location. Her skeleton showed evidence of hard labour and malnutrition. There was nothing about her burial to indicate she'd been Irish. No Irish artefacts, no Christian symbols, nothing. She had been completely absorbed into Norse society at its lowest level. Her Irish identity erased so thoroughly that only bone chemistry revealed it centuries later. The psychological experience of this cultural erasure adds another layer to the thriller's suffering. Cultural identity is fundamental to human well-being. It provides meaning, connection to history, sense of belonging. The captured frilla lost all of this violently and completely. She became a non-person, not only legally but culturally, cut off from her heritage with no possibility of maintaining or passing on her identity. She existed in a perpetual state of alienation, belonging nowhere, connected to nothing beyond the present moment of servitude. If she remembered her mother's lullabies, her village's festival celebrations, her language's poetry, these memories were useless, worse than useless, because they emphasized her loss and displacement. Better, perhaps, to forget, to let those memories fade until she couldn't quite recall them, until her past became dreamlike and uncertain. And her children, if she bore any, would have no connection to that heritage at all. They would be Norse, would know nothing of their mother's origins beyond perhaps her foreign appearance if it was distinctive. The sagas occasionally preserve hints of this. A character might be described as the daughter of an Irish thrall woman, or identified as having a Slavic mother. But these foreign mothers are rarely named, rarely given any identity beyond their origin, their narrative background, interesting only for the exotic element. They contribute to their children's ancestry. Their own experiences, languages, cultures, losses, all of this was apparently too unremarkable to record. Chapter 20. The violence, casual and constant. Throughout our examination of the thriller's daily life, violence has appeared repeatedly as a backdrop to every hardship. punishment for mistakes, enforcement of obedience, expression of anger or frustration by those with power. Now we need to confront this violence directly and understand that it wasn't exceptional or unusual. It was normalized, casual, constant, the basic mechanism through which the household controlled its unfree members. The frilla lived every moment knowing that violence could strike at any time, for any reason or no reason, with no recourse and no escape. The legal framework legitimized this violence explicitly. A master could beat his thrall for any reason or no reason. It was considered normal household discipline, analogous to training animals. The law provided no protection for thralls from their owner's violence except in one limited sense. A master couldn't kill someone else's thrall without compensating the owner, but a master killing his own thrall faced no legal penalty at all, and non-lethal violence was entirely unregulated. This meant that the frilla's daily existence included the constant possibility of being hit, kicked, slapped, or beaten. A mistake in her work, burning bread, spilling water, breaking a tool, might bring immediate physical punishment. The master's or mistress's bad mood might be vented through striking the nearest vulnerable person. A legitimate child angry about something might hit the frilla, knowing there would be no consequences. Even other thralls might participate in violence against someone even lower in the hierarchy, exercising the only power they possessed. The archaeological evidence for this violence is extensive and disturbing. Skeletal remains from low-status burials frequently show healed fractures that indicate violence rather than accidents, skull fractures from blows to the head, broken bones in forearms from defensive injuries, fractures in distinctive patterns suggesting assault. One study of Viking Age skeletons from several sites found that individuals from low-status burials showed violence-related injuries at 3 to 4 times the rate of high-status burials. Some of these injuries would have been debilitating. A broken arm that healed badly, leaving the arm shortened and weakened. Skull fractures that might have caused permanent neurological damage. Facial bones broken and healed crooked, leaving permanent disfigurement. Yet the individuals who bore these injuries apparently survived to continue working because they were buried later as adults, with evidence of continued hard labour after the injuries healed. The sagas mention violence against thralls with disturbing casualness, treating it as unremarkable background to daily life. One saga notes that a man beat his thrall who had spilled ale with the same matter-of-fact tone as noting weather conditions. Another mentions that a mistress was harsh with her servants and often had them beaten, as a character trait, but not one that requires condemnation or explanation. It was simply how that woman managed her household. More disturbing are the saga references to thralls being killed by their masters. These appear regularly, and are treated as the master's right, requiring no legal justification. He had his thrall killed for theft appears in multiple sagas, the execution considered a reasonable response to property crime. He killed his thrall in anger appears less often, but even then usually without condemnation. It might be mentioned as evidence of the master's temper, but not as a criminal act requiring punishment. Some skeletal evidence suggests these killings weren't always quick or merciful. Several skeletons from low-status burials show evidence of violent death, skull fractures that would have been immediately fatal, cut marks on bones suggesting death by edged weapons, and in some cases evidence suggesting the person had been bound or restrained before death. These aren't battle injuries. The individuals weren't warriors who died in combat. They were unfree people who died violently, probably at their master's hands, and were disposed of without ceremony. One particularly disturbing find from excavations at Flakstad in Norway included skeletal remains showing evidence of repeated trauma over time, multiple healed fractures of different ages, suggesting a pattern of ongoing violence, and finally evidence of violent death. The skeleton showed defensive wounds on the arms and a fatal blow to the skull. This person had survived being beaten repeatedly throughout their life, and finally died violently, probably murdered. They were buried in a shallow grave with no goods, their suffering recorded only in their broken bones. The psychological impact of living under constant threat of violence is profound and well documented in modern studies of abuse. The constant vigilance required, always watching for danger signs, always trying to anticipate what might trigger violence, never able to fully relax, creates chronic stress that damages both mental and physical health. The frilla lived in this state perpetually, with no safe space, no protection, no authority she could appeal to for help. And the violence wasn't just physical. Verbal abuse, threats, psychological intimidation, all of these were probably constant as well. Being cursed at, insulted, degraded, threatened with worse punishment or with sale or with death. This psychological violence reinforced the physical violence, creating an environment of total domination where the frilla's will was broken down through multiple forms of assault on her dignity and personhood. The effect of witnessing this violence on the household's children deserves mention as well. The legitimate children grew up, seeing the frilla and other thralls beaten casually, seeing violence used as a normal management tool, seeing certain categories of people treated as deserving violence while others were protected. This socialised them into the system, teaching them that violence toward the powerless was normal, acceptable, even necessary. And if the frilla had children, they witnessed their mother being beaten, learned that she couldn't protect them or herself, internalised their own worthlessness in a society that treated them and their mother as legitimate targets for casual violence. Chapter 21. Religious exclusion. Religion permeated every aspect of Viking Age life. Rituals marked the seasons, sacrifices sought divine favour, burial practices reflected beliefs about the afterlife. But the frilla's participation in this spiritual life was marginal at best, and her exclusion from full religious community reflected and reinforced her status as less than a complete person. Even in matters of the soul, she was subordinate, excluded, and ultimately disposable. The major religious ceremonies of Norse paganism, the blot sacrifices held at significant points in the calendar, were community events that reinforced social bonds and hierarchy. Animals were sacrificed, their blood sprinkled on altars and participants. Meat was cooked and shared in communal feasting. But participation in these rituals was stratified. The master and free household members had central roles. Thralls might be present but were observers and servants rather than full participants. They prepared food, served others, cleaned up afterward, but didn't share equally in the ritual's spiritual benefits or social bonding. This exclusion had practical implications. If the blot was meant to secure divine favour for the household, the frilla's welfare was clearly not the priority. The gods were being asked to bless the free members primarily. If sacrifices were made to ensure good harvests, the frilla would labour to bring in that harvest, but would eat least of its bounty. The spiritual economy of the household mirrored its material economy. The frilla's work sustained the system, but the system's benefits flowed primarily to others. Burial practices reveal this religious marginalisation most clearly. Free people of status received elaborate burials with grave goods, weapons, jewellery, tools, food, drink, sometimes horses or even ships. These items were meant to accompany the deceased into the afterlife, ensuring they arrived with appropriate status and resources. The burial itself was a ritual event, marking the person's passage and their importance to the community. Thralls received no such consideration. Their burials, when they can be identified archaeologically, are in marginal locations, away from proper cemeteries, in unconsecrated ground, sometimes simply in ditches or refuse areas. Grave goods are rare to non-existent. The burial is utilitarian, a body put in the ground with minimal ceremony, sometimes not even in a proper grave but just a shallow depression. The message is clear. This person's afterlife, if they were believed to have one at all, was not worth investing in. But there's a darker possibility suggested by some archaeological evidence. that thralls were sometimes sacrificed as part of their master's funeral rites. Several high-status burials include bodies that appear to be servants or slaves buried with the primary individual. Some of these additional bodies show evidence of having been bound or show signs of violent death. The Arabic traveller Ibn Fadlan, who witnessed a Norse funeral on the Volga in the 10th century, described a female slave being killed as part of a chieftain's funeral rites, a graphic, detailed account that suggests this wasn't unique or exceptional. Not all scholars agree on the interpretation of these multi-person burials, but the evidence is suggestive. Some skeletons in servant positions in graves show signs of trauma. Some are positioned in ways suggesting they were bound, and the historical accounts, though rare, describe human sacrifice as part of funeral rituals. If this was indeed practiced, it meant that the frilla's religious role might ultimately be as a human sacrifice. Her life ended to serve her master's needs even in death. For a frilla who had been captured from Christian lands, Ireland, England, parts of France, the religious dislocation would have been profound. She would have grown up in a Christian context with its rituals, beliefs and moral framework. Suddenly she was in a pagan society with completely different religious practices, unable to attend mass or receive sacraments, surrounded by what her original culture would have taught her were false gods and demonic practices. She might have tried to maintain her Christian faith privately, but this would have been difficult and potentially dangerous. Praying to the Christian god might be seen as disrespecting the Norse gods and bringing bad luck to the household. Making the sign of the cross might provoke punishment. If she tried to teach Christian beliefs to any children she bore, the master might forbid it. Her faith, like her language and culture, would be isolated and gradually eroded by the impossibility of practicing it. Archaeological evidence of this religious syncretism or suppression is hard to detect, but occasionally items suggest it. A few burials from Scandinavian sites include what appear to be Christian symbols alongside pagan Norse items, suggesting either mixed religious practice or confusion about the deceased's beliefs. One burial included what seemed to be a cross pendant along with traditional Norse grave goods, suggesting perhaps a person of mixed or uncertain religious identity, someone caught between traditions. The psychological dimension of religious exclusion adds another layer to the frilla's isolation. Religion provides meaning, community, hope for something beyond present suffering. The frilla was denied full access to the Norse religious community and, if she'd been Christian, was cut off from her original religious practice as well. She existed in a spiritual limbo, excluded from both worlds, with no religious framework that fully embraced her or offered hope for her circumstances. The sagas rarely mention thralls' religious beliefs or practices, which itself is telling. Their spiritual lives apparently weren't worth recording. They appear in religious contexts only as servants preparing for rituals or occasionally as victims of sacrifice. Their own beliefs, doubts, hopes, prayers, all of this was invisible to the people who controlled the historical record. Chapter 22. The Aging Frilla. Disposability. Throughout our examination of the frilla's life, we focus primarily on young and middle-aged women performing brutal labour. But we must now confront what happened when the frilla aged and her capacity for work declined. The answer reveals perhaps the most chilling aspect of treating humans as property. When property becomes useless, it's disposed of, and the aging frilla who could no longer work adequately faced abandonment, neglect, or deliberate elimination. The physical toll of decades of overwork meant that thrall women who survived to their 40s, and many didn't, were typically in terrible condition. The arthritis, the spinal damage, the respiratory disease, the accumulated injuries, all of these would have left the aging frilla increasingly incapacitated. Tasks that had been difficult became impossible. She might no longer be able to carry heavy water buckets, might not be able to kneel for hours grinding grain, might not have the strength for textile work or the mobility for animal tending. From the household's perspective, this was an economic problem. The frilla still consumed food and space, but provided progressively less labour. she had become a net drain on resources rather than a productive asset, and the legal and social framework that treated her as property rather than a person meant that the household felt no obligation to care for her in her decline. There was no concept of retirement or pension for thralls, no expectation that years of service earned the right to rest in old age. The sagas provide scattered, disturbing references to what happened to elderly or incapacitated thralls. Some mention thralls being sent away, a euphemism that probably meant abandonment. An elderly thrall no longer able to work might simply be turned out of the household to survive however they could, which in the harsh Scandinavian environment usually meant they didn't survive long. Others mention elderly thralls dying with a casualness that suggests their deaths were expected and unremarkable. One saga passage is particularly chilling. It mentions that a household had no use for old thralls, and notes that they didn't keep them long once they couldn't work. The passage doesn't elaborate on what happened to these elderly thralls, but the implication is clear. They were disposed of somehow. Whether through abandonment, deliberate killing, or simply through neglect that amounted to the same thing, elderly thralls who couldn't work were removed from the household. Archaeological evidence supports this picture of elderly thralls simply disappearing. Studies of skeletal remains from Viking Age sites show a curious absence. There are very few elderly individuals in low-status burials. High-status burials include people who lived into their 50s, 60s, even occasionally 70s, but thrall burials rarely include anyone over 45. This age gap is too consistent to be coincidental. It suggests that thralls who reached ages where they could no longer work adequately simply weren't surviving to elderly ages. Where did they go? Some probably died from the accumulated health problems we've documented, worn-out bodies simply giving out. But the absence of their burials, even in marginal locations, suggests that some weren't being buried at all, or were disposed of in ways that left no archaeological trace. Abandonment in remote areas, for instance, would leave the body to decompose or be scattered by animals, leaving no recoverable remains. Disposal in waterways would similarly leave no trace. There's also the disturbing possibility of deliberate killing when a thrall became too burdensome. The law permitted masters to kill their own thralls without penalty, and an elderly thrall who consumed resources without providing labour might be seen as worth eliminating. The sagas don't explicitly describe this often, but the casual mentions of thralls dying or disappearing when they became useless suggest it happened with some regularity. One archaeological find is suggestive. At a farm site, excavators found skeletal remains of an elderly woman buried in a shallow grave in a waste area. The skeleton showed evidence of severe arthritis, healed fractures, and malnutrition, but it also showed what appeared to be a fatal blow to the back of the skull, the kind of injury suggesting someone struck her from behind, killing her quickly. There were no grave goods, no proper burial, just a body disposed of in a midden area. The excavators suggested this might have been an elderly slave who was killed when she could no longer work, her body thrown away as refuse. The psychological reality for the aging frilla must have been terrifying. She would see her capacity declining, feel her body failing, know that her value to the household was diminishing, and unlike a free person who might be cared for by family in old age, or who had accumulated property that provided security, the frilla had nothing. No children who owed her filial duty. Any children she'd borne belonged to their father. No property to support herself. No legal rights to demand care. Just the growing certainty that when she could no longer work, she would be discarded. This created a grim incentive to conceal decline for as long as possible, to work through pain and incapacity, to hide the extent of her deterioration, because admitting she couldn't work adequately meant admitting she had no further value. The aging frilla probably pushed herself far beyond what her damaged body could sustain, working through agony because the alternative was abandonment or death. For those fortunate enough to gain freedom at some point, and this was rare, old age might still bring destitution. A freed elderly woman had legal personhood but no resources, no property, no family support system. Freedom without means is a hollow victory. The sagas mention occasionally that a freed thrall lived in poverty, begging or dependent on charity, barely surviving. Freedom in old age after decades of slavery might mean simply the freedom to starve slowly, rather than being disposed of quickly. Chapter 23. The Rare Path to Freedom. Throughout this examination of the frilla's existence, we've painted a picture of powerlessness and suffering with no escape. But we should acknowledge that some frilla did gain freedom, though the path was rare and the outcome often less transformative than it might seem. Understanding how freedom was obtained and what it actually meant reveals both the possibility of change and its limitations within this system. Norse law provided mechanisms for a thrall to become free. The master could grant freedom voluntarily, either during his lifetime or through provisions in his will. A thrall could theoretically purchase their own freedom if they somehow accumulated the necessary funds. In rare cases, freedom might come through the master's death and dissolution of the estate, though this usually meant the thralls were simply sold to new owners rather than freed. The most common path to freedom for a frilla was through the master's voluntary manumission, often motivated by specific circumstances. A master who had fathered children with his frilla might free her and the children, legitimizing them and providing them with some status and inheritance rights. This could happen if the master's legal wife had died or failed to provide heirs, making the frilla's children his only descendants. Or it might happen if the master developed genuine affection for the frilla. Rare, but human emotions sometimes complicated the property relationship. But manumission came with complications. A newly freed person, a freedman or freedwoman, wasn't fully equal to those born free. They occupied an intermediate status with lingering obligations to their former master. The Gragas law code specifies that freed thralls owed certain duties to the person who freed them, including labour obligations and inheritance restrictions. Freedom was conditional and partial, not the complete liberation we might imagine. For the frilla specifically, freedom often came late in life, after decades of service, when her labour capacity was already declining. By the time she was freed, her body was damaged, her health compromised, her youth and strength expended in servitude. Freedom at 45 after 25 years of slavery meant freedom to face old age with no resources, no property, no safety net. The legal status changed, but the practical reality might be only marginally better than continued enslavement. The sagas preserve a few stories of freed thralls, and these stories reveal the limitations of freedom without resources. The Laxdæla saga mentions a woman freed after bearing her master's son. She gained legal status and her son became prominent, but her own position remained precarious, dependent on her son's success and willingness to support her. Another saga mentions freed thralls living in poverty on marginal land, technically free but materially desperate. Archaeological evidence of social mobility from thrall to free status is difficult to detect, but some burials suggest it. Occasionally, excavators find graves that include some grave goods, but not the elaborate assemblages typical of the established free class, perhaps indicating people who had gained freedom but not wealth. One burial included a simple brooch and comb, suggesting the person had some property rights but limited means. Analysis suggested this was a woman who had spent her youth in hard labour but was buried with minimal status markers, possibly indicating freedom gained late in life. The process of purchasing one's own freedom was theoretically possible, but practically almost impossible. A thrall would need to accumulate funds equivalent to their market value, perhaps several years' wages for a free labourer. But thralls couldn't legally own property, had no wages, and had no time for independent work to earn money. The only way to accumulate funds would be through gifts from the master, or through selling handicrafts or services in whatever minimal free time they might have. This was effectively impossible for most thralls, and especially for frilla who had no time beyond their endless household duties. There are rare saga references to thralls being freed as a reward for extraordinary service, saving the master's life, displaying unusual loyalty, performing some exceptional feat. But these are clearly exceptional cases, story-worthy precisely because they were unusual. The vast majority of thralls lived and died in servitude with no prospect of freedom. For frilla who did gain freedom, reintegration into society was challenging. The stigma of having been enslaved persisted. Free people might be reluctant to associate with freed thralls as equals. Marriage prospects were limited. A free man might take a freed woman as a frilla, the cycle continuing. But marrying her formally was less likely. Any children she'd borne while enslaved remained marked by their mother's former status, even if they were freed as well. The psychological transition from slavery to freedom must have been complex. After decades of having every decision made for you, every action directed by others suddenly having autonomy would be disorienting. The skills needed for independent life, managing resources, making plans, negotiating with free people as equals, these weren't skills the frilla had developed during her enslavement. Freedom might bring bewilderment as much as relief. One saga passage captures this complexity. A newly freed woman is described as not knowing how to manage her freedom, having always been directed. The passage suggests she struggled to make decisions independently and eventually attached herself to another household in a quasi-dependent role. Freedom without preparation or resources wasn't necessarily liberation. It could be simply a different form of vulnerability. Chapter 24. The Archaeology of Suffering. Throughout this examination, we've relied heavily on archaeological evidence to reconstruct the frilla's lived experience. Now we should explicitly consider what the physical remains tell us, how researchers interpret bones and artifacts to understand suffering that the written record mostly ignored. The archaeology of Viking Age slavery reveals stories of pain, exploitation, and disposability that the sagas considered too mundane to record. Skeletal analysis is the primary tool for understanding thrall lives because bones preserve information about health, diet, labour patterns, and causes of death. When bioarchaeologists examine Viking Age skeletons, they can identify markers of social status through multiple indicators: burial location, presence or absence of grave goods, bone chemistry reflecting diet, skeletal stress markers indicating labour patterns, and evidence of violence or untreated injuries. One comprehensive study examined skeletal remains from multiple Norwegian sites, comparing individuals from high-status burials with those from low-status burials. The differences were stark across every measured variable. Low-status individuals were shorter on average, indicating childhood malnutrition. They showed more evidence of infectious disease, more signs of repetitive stress injuries, more indicators of hard physical labour, and more evidence of violence. They died younger on average. Their teeth showed more decay and disease. Their bones showed more evidence of mineral deficiency. The specific patterns of skeletal stress tell detailed stories. Vertebral compression in the lower back combined with shoulder joint degeneration suggests years of carrying heavy loads. Arthritic changes in the knees combined with wrist damage suggest years of kneeling work requiring repetitive hand motions, exactly the pattern you'd expect from grinding grain. Healed rib fractures combined with skull fractures suggest physical violence. Multiple stress lines in long bones indicate repeated periods of severe physiological stress, likely starvation or near starvation during late winter food shortages. One particularly well-documented case from excavations at Birka has become known in archaeological literature as the Birka slave skeleton. This was a woman's skeleton found in a low-status burial area with no grave goods. Analysis revealed she'd grown up in Britain based on isotope signatures in her tooth enamel, likely captured as a young woman and brought to Sweden. Her skeleton showed evidence of severe malnutrition throughout her life, repetitive stress damage consistent with grinding and textile work, several healed fractures including a skull fracture, chronic respiratory disease from smoke exposure, and finally death in her early 30s from what appeared to be infection. Her bones told a story of capture, enslavement, brutal labour, violence, and premature death. Exactly the pattern we've been documenting. Chemical analysis of bones can reveal diet with surprising precision. Stable isotope analysis examines ratios of carbon, nitrogen, and other elements in bone collagen to determine what types of food a person ate. High-status individuals show isotope ratios consistent with regular consumption of meat, fish, and dairy. Low-status individuals show ratios consistent with primarily grain-based diets with minimal animal protein, despite living in farming communities with livestock. They prepared meat for others, but rarely ate adequately themselves. Burial practices reveal social hierarchy with brutal clarity. The location and treatment of burial reflects how the deceased was valued. High-status individuals receive elaborate burials in prominent locations with extensive grave goods. Low-status individuals are buried in marginal areas, away from proper cemeteries, near property boundaries, in waste areas, sometimes in ditches or pits that appear to have been dug for other purposes. Grave goods are absent or minimal. The burial is utilitarian, suggesting the body was disposed of with minimal ceremony and that the person's death was considered unremarkable. Some mass graves found at Viking Age sites contain multiple bodies buried together without ceremony, often showing signs of violent death. These are interpreted as slave burials, people who died together, perhaps in an epidemic or through violence, and were buried communally because their individual deaths weren't considered worth separate attention. One such mass grave at Trelleborg in Denmark contained the bodies of several young women and children, none with grave goods, all buried together in a pit. The excavator suggested these were likely thralls who died during winter and were disposed of together when the ground thawed enough to dig. The evidence of violence in low-status skeletal remains is extensive. Healed fractures suggest non-lethal violence that the individual survived. Unhealed trauma suggests violent death. Cut marks on bones indicate death by edged weapons. Blunt force trauma to skulls indicates being struck with heavy objects. Some skeletons show evidence of being bound, grooves in wrist or ankle bones from rope or shackles. The frequency of violent indicators in low-status burials far exceeds that in high-status burials, suggesting that violence was a normal part of thrall experience. Excavation contexts tell stories too. Where thrall burials occur, when they can be identified, reveals how the community viewed these deaths. Burials in waste areas suggest the person was considered refuse. Burials near work areas suggest they died while working and were buried conveniently nearby. Burials in unusual positions or with evidence of binding suggest they may have been executed or sacrificed. The lack of burials for many thralls suggests some were never formally buried at all, but were disposed of in ways that left no archaeological trace. Modern analytical techniques continue to reveal new information. DNA analysis can identify family relationships, showing whether buried individuals were related. This has revealed some cases of mothers buried with children, though it's unclear whether they died together or were buried together later. Trauma analysis using modern forensic techniques can distinguish between accidental injuries and deliberate violence. Microscopic analysis of bone surfaces can reveal evidence of disease that wasn't visible to earlier researchers. The overall picture that emerges from archaeological analysis is consistent and grim. A large population of people living in conditions of severe deprivation, performing brutal labour, experiencing frequent violence, dying young, and being disposed of with minimal ceremony. These physical remains preserve evidence of suffering that the written record mostly ignored, giving voice to people who had no voice in their own time. Chapter 25. The Invisible Women. We arrive at our final chapter, and perhaps the most important point to understand about Viking Age frilla. They were invisible. Not literally, of course. They were physically present, performing essential labour, bearing children, existing in plain sight. But they were invisible in the sense that mattered. Their stories weren't recorded, their experiences weren't considered worth documenting, their suffering was so ordinary that it generated no comment. They were there, but they weren't seen as worthy of seeing. These sagas, our primary written sources for Viking Age life, mention thralls frequently but almost always in passing. A character owns thralls the way they own livestock. A transaction involves selling a thrall. A household includes servants who perform background tasks. But the thralls themselves are rarely named, rarely described in detail, never given interior lives or emotional depth. They're narrative furniture, present but unimportant, except when they affect the stories of free people who mattered. Consider what this means. There were thousands of women living as frilla in Viking Age Scandinavia. Each had a life, experiences, thoughts, feelings, relationships, suffering, moments of hope or despair. Each was as fully human as the free people around them. Yet their names are mostly lost. Their individual stories are unrecorded. What we know about them comes from scattered fragments, incidental mentions, and the mute testimony of their bones in the ground. This historical erasure wasn't accidental or surprising. It reflected the society's values. The people who produced the written record, the saga authors, the law code compilers, the runic inscription carvers, were free people writing for free audiences about matters that concerned the free population. Thralls appeared in these records only when relevant to free people's stories. Their own experiences from their own perspectives apparently weren't worth recording. The effect of this erasure is profound. We have detailed accounts of Viking raids, of legal disputes, of family feuds and political manoeuvring. We know the names of dozens of chieftains and warriors. We can reconstruct political structures and trading networks and settlement patterns, but we cannot reconstruct the inner life of a single frilla from written sources. Their voices are completely absent from the historical record they helped create through their labour. Archaeological evidence provides some compensation for this written silence. Bones preserve information about labour, diet, violence and death that the sagas omitted. Grave context reveals status hierarchies that legal codes formalised. The spatial distribution of artefacts in longhouses shows who slept where, who ate what, who had access to valuable objects. But archaeology can't tell us what the frilla thought about her life, what she hoped for, how she coped psychologically, what stories she told herself to survive. That subjective experience is lost, probably forever. Even the physical remains are incomplete. We have relatively few identified thrall burials, and those we have are probably not representative. The thralls who were buried at all, even without ceremony or grave goods, may have been treated better than those who simply disappeared. Abandoned to die, disposed of in water, left unburied. The archaeological record captures only those deaths that left recoverable remains, which may be a small percentage of actual thrall deaths. The contrast with how we remember other historical figures is striking. A single famous Viking warrior might have extensive saga accounts, runic memorial stones, archaeological remains of elaborate burials. We remember their names, their deeds, their personalities as constructed by the sources. Meanwhile, thousands of women whose labour made that warrior's household function are completely forgotten. We know vastly more about high-status people's weapons and jewellery than about the daily lives of the people who actually kept society functioning through their work. This pattern of remembering the powerful and forgetting the powerless isn't unique to the Viking Age, of course. It characterises most historical periods. But recognising it helps us understand why recovering the frilla's experience requires such effort. We're trying to reconstruct lives that were considered unworthy of recording, to give voice to people who were systematically silenced, to see people who were deliberately rendered invisible. There's something profoundly important about this effort despite its difficulty. These were real people who lived and suffered and died. Their experiences were as valid, as real, as worthy of consideration as any famous warrior or chieftain. The The fact that their society considered them worthless doesn't mean we must accept that judgment. By examining the fragments we have, the scattered saga references, the anonymous bones, the archaeological traces, we can partially recover their stories and resist the historical erasure their society imposed. When we call this boring history, we're being somewhat ironic. The details are unglamorous, certainly. Grain grinding and water hauling and laundry don't make for exciting television. But there's nothing boring about the lived reality we've examined. The crushing exhaustion, the constant hunger, the systematic violence, the profound powerlessness. It's deeply uncomfortable history that asks us to sit with suffering rather than glory, that shows us the underside of a celebrated culture. The frilla's invisibility in their own time challenges us to see them now. Every romantic Viking drama that features a beautiful concubine living in relative comfort obscures the reality we've documented. Every focus on raids and exploration that ignores the slave economy funding those ventures distorts the historical picture. By examining the boring, unglamorous, deeply uncomfortable details of daily existence for unfree women, we correct that distortion and honour the reality of their lives. So as we conclude these 25 chapters, remember this. Behind every Viking Age household that produced the warriors and traders and explorers we remember, there were women whose names we'll never know, who performed essential labour without choice or reward, who bore children they couldn't claim, who suffered violence and exploitation as ordinary conditions of existence, who died young from exhaustion or violence or disease, and who were buried without ceremony or simply disposed of as worthless. They were there. They mattered. Their absence from the historical record is itself a story worth telling, a story about who gets remembered and why, about whose suffering counts as worthy of attention, about the work required to see people their own society rendered invisible. And so we reach the end of our journey through the daily life of a Viking Age frilla. We've walked through her existence hour by hour, task by exhausting task, examining the unglamorous reality that popular culture so often romanticizes. We've seen that her life was defined not by exotic adventure or forbidden romance, but by brutal physical labour, systematic sexual exploitation, chronic malnutrition, constant vulnerability to violence, and the profound powerlessness of legal non-personhood. Every task we examined, the water hauling, the grain grinding, the cooking, the textile production, the animal tending, was coloured by her unfree status. She performed these labours not through choice, but through coercion, not for her own benefit, but for others who considered her property. The work itself was demanding enough to destroy bodies within a few decades, and it was performed without adequate rest, without adequate nutrition, without medical care when injuries occurred, without any prospect of improvement or escape. Beyond the physical hardships, we've explored the psychological dimensions of her existence. The constant threat of violence, the inability to protect her own children, the knowledge that she could be sold away from anything familiar at any moment, the cultural and linguistic erasure if she'd been captured from foreign lands, the religious exclusion that denied her full spiritual community, the complete absence of autonomy over her own body and life. These combined to create an existence of profound suffering that went far beyond mere physical discomfort. The frilla woke in darkness and worked until collapse. She ate last and least, despite preparing food for others. She bore children she couldn't legally claim. She aged rapidly under the stress of overwork and was disposed of when she could no longer labour adequately. She died young, was buried without ceremony, and was forgotten so thoroughly that we don't even know their names. The archaeological record preserves evidence of their broken bodies, but the written record barely acknowledges they existed as individual human beings. This matters because understanding historical reality, not romantic fantasy, helps us comprehend how systems of exploitation actually function. The Norse didn't need to be uniquely evil for slavery to be brutal. They simply treated certain categories of people as property rather than persons. and from that legal and social structure, all the suffering we've documented followed logically. The casual violence, the sexual exploitation, the disposability, these weren't aberrations or exceptions. They were the normal operation of a system that denied some humans their fundamental personhood. And yet, even knowing all this, even having examined the evidence in such detail, we still struggle to fully comprehend what it meant to live this existence. We can document the labour demands and calculate the inadequate calories and measure the skeletal damage, but we cannot truly know what it felt like to be so completely powerless, so thoroughly degraded, so systematically erased. Their subjective experience remains partially inaccessible to us, lost in the silence that surrounded their lives and deaths. Before we close, it's worth considering why recovering these stories matters beyond simple historical curiosity. The frilla's experience speaks to broader questions about power, exploitation, and whose stories get told. Even today, certain forms of labour are rendered invisible, certain categories of workers are treated as less deserving of dignity and protection, certain people's suffering is considered unremarkable background noise rather than urgent moral crisis. We live in a world where domestic workers, agricultural labourers, garment factory workers, and others perform essential labour in conditions that would shock us if we examined them as closely as we've examined the frilla's life. The specific mechanisms differ. Legal chattel slavery is largely abolished, but the dynamics of exploitation, invisibility, and disposability persist in modified forms. Understanding how these dynamics operated historically helps us recognise them in contemporary contexts. There's also something important in simply acknowledging suffering that was considered unremarkable in its own time. The Viking Age Scandinavians who owned frilla weren't monsters. They were ordinary people operating within their society's accepted norms. They believed, apparently without much doubt, that some humans could legitimately be property of other humans. This belief was embedded in their legal codes, their economic systems, their daily practices, their religious frameworks. It was normal, and most people never questioned it. This should make us reflect on our own normal. What structures of exploitation do we participate in without questioning? What suffering do we consider unremarkable, whose voices are absent from our contemporary record because we don't think their experiences matter enough to document? The frilla's invisibility in her own time should prompt us to ask who is invisible in ours and why. At the same time, we should be careful not to use historical suffering as merely a metaphor for contemporary issues. The frilla's experience was specific, particular, real in itself. These women lived and suffered and died, and their stories deserve to be told on their own terms, not simply as lessons for modern audiences. They were people, not object lessons, and recovering their experience is valuable because they were human beings whose lives mattered, regardless of what moral or political points we might draw from examining them. The contrast between the romanticized version of Viking Concubines and the reality we've documented also reveals something about how we prefer to consume history. We like our past to be exciting, dramatic, perhaps a bit dangerous, but ultimately entertaining. The boring details, the endless grain grinding, the chronic diarrhea from parasitic infections, the smoke-damaged lungs, the hands destroyed by lye soap, these don't fit the romantic narrative. They're unglamorous, uncomfortable, and deeply disturbing. But they're also real, and reality should matter more than our preference for comfortable fantasy. So when you encounter depictions of Viking Age life in popular culture, when you see the beautiful concubine living in the chieftain's household, remember what we've examined here. Remember the water hauling and the beatings and the hunger and the disposability. Remember that the romantic version isn't just inaccurate, it's an erasure that does disservice to people who already suffered enough without having their experiences distorted into entertainment for modern audiences. Thank you for staying with me through this long, difficult exploration. I know this hasn't been easy listening. The details are often disturbing. The cumulative effect of examining such sustained suffering can be emotionally draining, and there's no happy ending or redemptive arc to provide comfort. These were lives of almost unrelieved hardship, and acknowledging that reality means sitting with discomfort rather than finding easy consolation. If you've made it this far, you've demonstrated a willingness to engage with history in its full complexity, not just its exciting or uplifting aspects. You've been willing to spend hours examining the unglamorous details of daily existence for people your own society would have considered beneath notice. That willingness to see people who were systematically rendered invisible is itself a kind of remembrance, a refusal to let their erasure be complete. This is what Boring History for Sleep attempts to do, not to bore you in the sense of being uninteresting, but to examine the boring details that reveal so much about how ordinary people actually lived. The grain grinding and water hauling, the smoke and cold and hunger, the repetitive labour and chronic pain. These are boring in the sense that they're not dramatic, not exciting, not the stuff of epic poetry, but they're also the texture of most human experience throughout history, and understanding them brings us closer to historical reality than any number of battle narratives or royal genealogies. If you've found value in this exploration, please consider subscribing to the channel. It helps more than you might imagine, and allows me to continue creating this kind of content. If you have thoughts about this video, or suggestions for future topics, the comments are open and I do read them. And if this particular topic has been too heavy, remember that the channel includes many other subjects, some dark like this one, others more neutral, or even occasionally uplifting. There's a whole catalogue to explore if you're interested, but for now, let's move toward rest. You've been patient and attentive through hours of difficult material, and you've earned some peace. Picture, if you will, a different kind of darkness than the one the frilla experienced. Not the darkness of a smoky longhouse in the depths of a Scandinavian winter, not the darkness that comes before dawn when the day's brutal labour must begin, but the gentle darkness of your own comfortable space, wherever you are in the world. A darkness chosen, a darkness that means safety and rest, rather than confinement and exhaustion. You have control over this darkness in ways the frilla never did. You can turn on a light if you choose, you can adjust the temperature, you can reach for water without hauling it from a frozen stream, you can rest when you're tired without someone kicking you awake to begin work. These ordinary comforts, so mundane you probably barely notice them, represent freedoms and securities that the frilla could never have imagined. Your ability to simply lie down and rest, uninterrupted, safe, adequate, is itself a profound privilege. As you settle into sleep tonight, you carry no water buckets, grind no grain, tend no fires, fear no master's summons. Your body is your own, your rest is yours to take. The morning will come when it comes, and you will wake when you wake, and no one will beat you for the delay. This autonomy, this security, this basic dignity, these are not small things, even though they feel ordinary. They are what the frilla was denied every moment of her existence. Perhaps there's something valuable in recognising this contrast, not to feel guilty about comforts we enjoy, but simply to understand that they're not universal, not guaranteed, not automatic. They're the product of specific historical developments, legal structures, social norms that granted certain people, increasingly more people over time, the basic rights to bodily autonomy, adequate rest, freedom from arbitrary violence. The frilla had none of these, and remembering her experience helps us understand how precious they are. The northern night sky that the frilla might have glimpsed in rare moments, perhaps during a brief trip to the stream, perhaps looking up from her labour just for a moment. That same sky arches over you now. The stars she saw are the stars you could see if you looked outside. The same moon, the same vast darkness of space stretching infinitely above. She was as human as you are, felt cold and pain and exhaustion with the same nerves and brain, lived and suffered and died under the same sky. The 1,000 years between her time and yours is nothing compared to the human commonality you share. So as you drift towards sleep, spare a thought for the invisible women, the ones who hauled water until their spines compressed, the ones who ground grain until their hands were ruined, the ones who bore children they couldn't claim, the ones who died exhausted in their 20s and were buried without ceremony and forgotten so completely that we don't even know their names. They were there. They mattered. Their suffering was real, even though their society considered it unremarkable. Their lives deserved to be remembered, even in this partial, reconstructed way, even in this strange modern context of someone falling asleep while listening to their story. Let the darkness be gentle with you. Let your rest be deep and uninterrupted. Let your dreams be peaceful, or if not peaceful, at least yours alone, not invaded by demands or violence or fear. You have earned this rest simply by being human, by existing, by making it through another day. The frilla was denied this basic dignity, but you don't have to be. Rest well, rest deeply, rest with the knowledge that your sleeping body is safe, your tomorrow is your own, your personhood is secure. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring about boring history, for being willing to examine the unglamorous details that reveal so much, for spending these hours with me in the darkness exploring lives that were lived in darkness of a very different kind. If you found this valuable, the channel is here whenever you need it, full of other journeys into the past, other stories of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, other boring details that turn out to matter more than we expected. Sleep well, dear listener, and remember, you are fortunate beyond measure simply to have the freedom to close your eyes and rest in peace. Good night.